Ryden Price slammed his hand down on the defense table hard enough to make the water pitcher jump, leaned toward his ex-wife and snarled the words loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "You will walk out of here with nothing, Amelia. Absolutely nothing. You should have taken the deal when I offered it." His fiancée laughed behind him, twisting a diamond the size of a promise he never once kept in 11 years of marriage. Amelia didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Because in exactly 11 minutes, everything Ryden Price had built his new life on was about to collapse in front of every person he'd tried so hard to impress. Before we go further, hit subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Superior Courtroom 3. O2 was cold in the way government buildings always seem to be cold. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside and everything to do with the kind of decisions made inside its walls. Amelia Gallagher sat at the plaintiff's table with her hands folded in her lap, spine straight, chin level, breathing slow and even the way she'd trained herself to breathe over the past 14 months of hearings, filings, and sleepless nights. She wore a simple charcoal blazer, no jewelry except her late mother's small gold cross. To anyone glancing over from the gallery, she looked like a woman who already knew she'd lost. That was exactly the impression she wanted to give. Across the aisle, Ryden Price sat like a man performing grief for an audience he assumed was already on his side. His suit had been tailored to look slightly too big, the jacket hanging with practiced defeat off shoulders that hadn't actually lost an ounce of the gym-built bulk he was so proud of. His eyes carried faint shadows, though anyone who'd known him well would have recognized concealer applied a shade too dark. Beside him sat Brittany Carmichael, 26, blonde, and unable to stop glancing at her own left hand, as if she needed to keep confirming the ring was real. 5 carats cushion cut, catching the fluorescent light every time she turned it just so, and she turned it often, always in Amelia's direction. "Poor thing," Brittany whispered to the woman beside her, not troubling to lower her voice enough. "She looks like she hasn't slept in a year." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through a few rows of the gallery. Amelia's attorney, Denise Okafor, placed a steady hand over Amelia's on the table. A silent signal. Not yet. Judge Harmon entered and the room rose, then settled, the rustle of fabric and shuffling papers fading into stillness. He was heavy-set in his 60s with a reputation for moving through cases fast and having zero patience for theater. "We're here today," he said, flipping open a folder, "to finalize matters regarding spousal support asset division and outstanding claims in the matter of Gallagher versus Price. Mr. Price, your attorney has filed extensive documentation regarding the current financial state of Price Industries. Let's begin there." Ryden's attorney, Grant Wexler, rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor. As the court is aware, Price Industries has suffered catastrophic losses over the past 18 months due to global supply chain disruptions, rising material costs, and the loss of 3 major distribution contracts. My client's net worth, once approximately $40 million, has been reduced to functional insolvency." A murmur moved through the gallery. Somewhere behind Amelia, a woman whispered, "$40 million to nothing." Ryden lowered his head, the picture of a broken man accepting his fate. He'd practiced that exact tilt of the chin in the mirror for weeks, back when he still had a mirror in a house that was legally his. "Mr. Price," the judge said, "is it your position that you're unable to meet spousal support obligations at this time?" "Yes, Your Honor." His voice cracked at the edges, calibrated for maximum sympathy. "I've lost everything. My company, my savings. I'm starting over from zero." Brittany squeezed his hand, mouthing something comforting, her diamond catching the light in a way that felt almost cruel. A broke man's fiancé wearing a ring that could have covered 2 years of mortgage payments, though nobody in the gallery seemed to notice the contradiction sitting in plain sight. Amelia noticed. She noticed everything now. She'd spent 11 years not noticing, and the past 14 months relearning how. Denise rose. "Your Honor, if I may." "Go ahead, Counselor." "My client has reviewed the financial statements submitted by Mr. Price's team, and we have concerns regarding their completeness." Denise's voice was calm, unhurried, a woman who had all the time in the world because she already knew how this ended. Specifically, we've noted unusual gaps in the company's international transaction records over the past 14 months. Wexler stood fast. Your Honor, my client has provided full financial disclosure in accordance with— Full disclosure of what he wanted disclosed, Denise said, cutting through smoothly. We believe additional records exist that weren't included in this filing. Ryden's jaw tightened. Just barely. Just for a fraction of a second. Amelia caught it anyway. She'd spent years learning to read that face when she thought she was reading love. Now she was using the same fluency to read guilt, and it turned out guilt and love looked remarkably similar on a man who'd never told her the truth about either one. She remembered the night 3 years back when she'd asked him a simple question over dinner, why the company's quarterly numbers didn't match what he'd told his own accountant, and he'd set his fork down. Slowly, looked at her with a patience that felt more like a threat and said, Amelia, I built this company from nothing. I don't need my wife auditing me at the dinner table. She'd apologized. She remembered apologizing. She remembered thinking she'd overstepped, that she'd embarrassed him, that a good wife trusted her husband's judgment about money the way she trusted him about everything else. She didn't apologize anymore. Not for anything. Your Honor, Denise continued, we'd like the court's permission to introduce supplementary documentation obtained through independent forensic accounting. The judge's eyebrow lifted. Independent forensic accounting counselor, that's unusual for a hearing of this nature. I understand, Your Honor, but given the significant financial claims being made by the respondent and the significant support at stake for my client, the court has an interest in ensuring those claims are accurate. Wexler was already leaning toward Ryden, whispering urgently. Ryden shook his head, mouthed something that looked a lot like, it's handled, the exact words of a guilty man right before the walls start coming down around him. The judge tapped his pen against the folder, considering. I'll allow it. Proceed, counselor. Keep it relevant. Thank you, Your Honor. Denise turned, and for the first time since the hearing began, Amelia allowed herself the faintest breath of something like relief. Not victory yet, just a door creaking open that Ryden had spent 1.5 years trying to keep bolted shut. Denise gestured to her paralegal, who wheeled in a small cart with a laptop and projector cable. Your Honor, over the past 4 months, my client engaged a team of forensic accountants to review the operational history of Price Industries, focusing specifically on transactions flagged as high risk under international banking compliance standards. Objection. Wexler was on his feet again, more urgency in his voice now. This is speculative and prejudicial. Overruled for now, counselor. Let's see what she has. Ryden's leg had started bouncing beneath the table, a small tremor he probably wasn't even aware of. Brittany noticed placing a hand on his knee, frowning the first genuine crack in her performance of adoring fiancé. She didn't know what was coming. She only knew something felt wrong. The projector clicked on, casting a spreadsheet across the wall-mounted screen. Numbers, columns, dates, partially redacted account strings. What you're looking at, Denise said, is a summary of wire transfers originating from 3 subsidiary accounts connected to Price Industries over a period beginning approximately 16 months ago. Conveniently, Your Honor, just before Mr. Price filed the paperwork claiming financial insolvency. The gallery had gone very quiet. Even the bailiff leaned forward slightly. These transfers, Denise continued, total approximately $11 million routed through 2 intermediary accounts before reaching destinations our forensic team has identified as offshore holding entities. This is absurd. Ryden couldn't stop himself, voice rising for the first time since the hearing began. You have no idea what you're looking at. Those are legitimate business transactions. Mr. Price, the judge snapped, you'll address the court through your counsel. Ryden sat back, jaw clenched, a muscle ticking near his temple. Amelia watched him with an odd, distant calm. This was the man who used to tell her she was being dramatic whenever she asked a simple question about their finances. This was the man who used to say, "Don't worry your pretty little head about the business. Sweetheart, just enjoy the life it gives you," right before handing her a credit card with a limit he controlled and a smile that made the leash feel like a gift. She thought about the year their daughter needed braces, and Ryden told her the company couldn't absorb the hit right now. And she'd taken a second job at a dental office, answering phones, just to cover it working nights after he was already home watching football with a beer he'd bought without blinking. She thought about explaining to her son why they couldn't afford the summer camp his friends were all going to, watching his face fall, telling him maybe next year. While his father was somewhere on a yacht he swore belonged to a business partner. $11 million. And she'd been counting quarters for a copay. Denise clicked to the next slide. And this, she said, is only the beginning. The recess bell rang 15 minutes later, and the room emptied into the hallway in a wave of hushed speculation. Amelia stood near the window at the end of the corridor, arms crossed loosely, watching the parking lot below without really seeing it. Denise appeared beside her, holding 2 paper cups of coffee, offering one. "You okay?" Denise asked quietly. "I'm fine," Amelia said, and mostly meant it. A strange calm had settled over her, the kind that comes after years of anxiety, finally finding somewhere to land. "How much more do you have?" "Enough," Denise said, a small, knowing smile tugging at her mouth. "But Amelia, I need you to understand something. What we found, it's bigger than 11 million, much bigger than what I showed today." Amelia turned to face her fully. "How much bigger?" Denise glanced down the hallway to make sure no one was in earshot. "We're still confirming exact numbers, but based on what our team has traced, and based on some very interesting intelligence that came to us 2 weeks ago from an outside party, this could be over 20 million, possibly more." Something cold settled in Amelia's chest. Not fear, something closer to disbelief wrapped tight around fury. 20 million! He told me for years we were struggling. He made me feel guilty for wanting new shoes for the kids before the school year started. He told our daughter braces were a luxury we'd figure out eventually. "I know," Denise said gently. "And this whole time—" Amelia stopped herself, pressing her lips together, forcing the feeling back down where it belonged. Not here, not yet. Save it for the room where it would matter. "You mentioned an outside party," Amelia said instead. "What outside party?" Denise's expression shifted, careful now, deliberate. "That's actually something I wanted to discuss before we go back in. A man reached out to my office about 6 weeks ago. He'd been running his own investigation into Price Industries for reasons completely separate from your case." "What reasons?" "Business reasons," Denise said. "He recently acquired a large portion of Price Industries' outstanding debt through a distressed asset fund. When his team started reviewing the books as part of that acquisition, they found irregularities, big ones, and when they dug further, the irregularities lined up almost perfectly with the timeline of your divorce filing." Amelia frowned. "Who is this man?" "His name is Nathaniel Rothschild," Denise said. "And Amelia, he asked to be here today." The careful testing way Denise said it made Amelia's stomach tighten. "Here, as in the courtroom." "He's already inside," Denise said. "Third row back corner. He arrived about 10 minutes before the hearing started, kept a low profile. I didn't want it to throw you off before your testimony, so I waited to tell you now." Amelia's mind raced back through the gallery, trying to recall a face she might have passed over without registering. She hadn't looked at the crowd that morning. She'd trained herself these past months to keep her focus locked on Ryden, on Denise, on the judge refusing to let anything else pull her attention away. "Why would a stranger care this much about my divorce?" Amelia asked. Denise's smile deepened slightly. "Very good question. I think you're about to get your answer because court resumes in 5 minutes, and unless I'm very wrong, Mr. Rothschild has requested to testify." "Testify? About what exactly?" "About 22 million reasons your ex-husband is about to have a very bad morning," Denise said, and for the first time all day there was something almost like warmth in her voice. "Amelia, I want you to hear me on this. Whatever happens in the next hour, you did this. You're the one who kept records when he told you not to bother. You're the one who remembered account numbers he thought you never looked at. His arrogance handed us half of this case. Rothschild's team just filled in the rest." Amelia felt her throat tighten unexpectedly, and she blinked hard, refusing to let it show. "I just want my kids to see their mother stand up straight one time. That's all I ever wanted out of this." "Then let's go stand up straight," Denise said. Back inside the room filled again the hum of conversation settling as the bailiff called for order. Amelia took her seat, more aware now of the gallery behind her than she'd been all morning. She resisted the urge to turn and scan faces, keeping her posture straight, her eyes forward, trusting Denise to control the pace of what was coming. Ryden looked marginally less composed than before the break. His tie had loosened, and Brittany was whispering urgently to him, her earlier smugness replaced by something closer to nerves. "What did they show you during recess?" Brittany hissed. "You said this account was clean. You told me this money was from consulting." "It is," Ryden muttered. "Just let me handle this. Stop talking." "I don't like this, Ryden. I don't like the way that lawyer was smiling when she walked back in." "Counselor," the judge said, addressing Denise, "you may continue." "Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, we'd like to call an additional witness, someone who isn't a party to this case but whose testimony is directly relevant to the financial claims made by the respondent." Wexler shot up. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. A surprise witness at this stage of proceedings." "He's not entirely a surprise, Counselor," Denise said smoothly. "We filed a supplemental witness notice with the court clerk this morning prior to the hearing's start. I believe you should have received a copy." Wexler shuffled through his papers, clearly having missed it or dismissed it as routine paperwork in the rush of the morning. His face reddened. "The witness is here voluntarily," Denise continued, "and given the financial nature of his testimony and the significant public interest in accurate proceedings, I believe the court will find his presence valuable." The judge studied her for a long moment, then glanced toward the gallery. "Very well. Call your witness." Denise turned toward the back of the room. "The plaintiff calls Nathaniel Rothschild." A sharp murmur moved through the gallery, the kind of reaction that happens when a room full of strangers suddenly recognizes a name they've read in financial headlines but never expected to hear spoken aloud in a small county courtroom. Somewhere near the back, a phone camera clicked before a bailiff shot a warning glance in that direction. Amelia turned, unable to stop herself. A man rose from the third row. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark navy suit that fit with the understated precision of money that never needed to announce itself. Mid-40s dark hair touched with silver at the temples, an expression calm and unreadable as he moved toward the aisle. He didn't rush. He didn't look nervous. He walked like a man who had never once doubted he belonged exactly where he was standing. Ryden's face went white. "No," he whispered low enough that only Brittany and Wexler heard him, though Amelia, watching closely, read the shape of the word on his lips. No, he can't be here. Not him." Nathaniel Rothschild walked past the plaintiff's table, and for the briefest moment, his eyes met Amelia's. Nothing dramatic passed between them. No wink, no smile. Just a brief, steady acknowledgement, like two people recognizing each other across a crowded room without needing a single word. Then he continued forward, was sworn in by the bailiff, and took his seat in the witness box with the calm efficiency of a man who'd testified in far more intimidating rooms than this one. "Mr. Rothschild," Denise began, "can you state your occupation for the court?" "I'm the managing partner of Ashcroft Meridian Capital," he said, voice deep, even unhurried. "We specialize in distressed asset acquisition and corporate restructuring. And your connection to this case?" "Approximately 5 months ago, my firm acquired a substantial portion of the outstanding debt held against Price Industries purchased at a significant discount from the original lending institution, which had flagged the company as high risk. During that acquisition process, what did you discover?" Nathaniel reached into his jacket and produced a slim folder, sliding it toward the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "As part of our due diligence, my team runs forensic audits on every distressed asset we acquire. What we found in the case of Price Industries wasn't simple financial mismanagement. It was a deliberate, structured pattern of asset concealment." The room had gone completely silent, the specific silence of 100 people holding their breath at once. "Please elaborate." "Over the past 18 months, Nathaniel continued, Mr. Price systematically transferred company assets into a series of shell entities registered in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. These transfers were disguised in internal documentation as business restructuring costs and supply chain investment. In reality, they represent a deliberate effort to hide liquid assets from creditors and based on the timeline from a pending divorce settlement." Ryden shot to his feet. "This is a lie? You're trying to destroy me because I wouldn't sell you my company for pennies on the dollar." "Mr. Price, sit down," the judge said sharply. "He's lying. Your Honor, this man has a vendetta. Sit down or I will have you removed from this courtroom." Ryden sat chest-heaving, face flushed dark, now every trace of the humble, broken businessman gone. Brittany had gone very still beside him, staring at the folder in the judge's hands like it might reach out and grab her personally. It could. "Mr. Rothschild," Denise continued, "can you confirm the total value of assets your team has traced through this concealment structure?" "Yes," Nathaniel said. "As of this morning's updated report, we've traced a total of $22,140,000 moved through 6 shell entities over the 18-month period in question." A gasp moved through the gallery. Someone near the back said, "22 million," loud enough to draw a sharp look from the bailiff. Amelia sat perfectly still and let the number settle into her chest like a stone dropped into water. $22 million while she'd worked 2 jobs the past year to cover legal fees, while her children asked why they couldn't afford summer camp, while Ryden sat across from her in mediation sighing about how little he had left to give. And Mr. Rothschild, Denise said, her voice carrying now the deliberate weight of a lawyer about to deliver the final blow. "Were you able to trace the destination of these funds? Specifically, were any accounts identified as connected to individuals present in this courtroom today?" Nathaniel nodded once. "Yes. Approximately $4.3 million of the traced funds were deposited into 2 accounts registered under the name Brittany Carmichael, opened within the past 8 months." The courtroom erupted. Brittany shot up so fast her chair scraped loud against the floor. "What? No, I don't, Ryden. What is he talking about?" Her voice cracked high and panicked, every trace of smug confidence gone. "I didn't know anything about this. You told me that money was from your consulting work. Brittany, sit down. Shut up," Ryden hissed, grabbing her wrist. "Don't touch me." She yanked her arm back so hard she nearly stumbled. "You told me that account was clean. You told me it was fine. I'm going to lose my nursing license. I'm going to—" Her voice dissolved into something close to a sob as she turned wildly toward the gallery. "I need my own lawyer. I need a lawyer right now. This is not happening." "Order," the judge shouted, banging his gavel hard enough that the crack echoed through the room. "Order in this court, or I will clear it." Wexler had gone pale, whispering urgently to his client who was no longer listening, staring instead at the folder on the judge's desk, like it might detonate. Ryden's mask, so carefully built, had shattered completely in 90 seconds, and underneath it was raw panic, cornered and exposed. Amelia sat still through all of it, watching the man she'd once loved come apart in real time, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph exactly, not even satisfaction. Something quieter. The specific relief of a truth finally standing where a lie used to be. The judge banged his gavel twice more before the room settled into a tense, humming quiet, broken only by Brittany's ragged breathing. "Mr. Wexler," the judge said, voice low and dangerous now, "does your client wish to respond to these allegations, or do you need a recess to confer?" Wexler rose slowly, and for the first time all morning, he looked like a man who understood exactly how bad this had gotten. "Your Honor, we'd request a brief recess to review the documentation." "Granted. 15 minutes. The judge's eyes swept the room, landing pointedly on Ryden. "I'd advise your client to use that time wisely, Counselor, because right now what I'm looking at isn't a divorce settlement dispute. It's the outline of a federal fraud case." The gavel came down one final time, and the room erupted into a wall of noise, whispers turning into open conversation. Phones coming out, despite the bailiff's protests. Brittany still sobbing. Something incoherent about her license, her career, her entire future, collapsing on a Tuesday morning in a county courtroom she'd walked into, wearing a 5-carat diamond and a smile built on someone else's ruin. Ryden didn't move. He sat frozen, staring straight ahead at nothing. Color completely drained from his face, looking for the first time in 11 years, exactly as small as he'd always tried to make Amelia feel. Amelia rose slowly, smoothing her blazer, and for one brief moment her eyes met Nathaniel's as he stepped down from the witness stand. He gave her the faintest nod. Nothing more. Nothing that needed explaining. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Because every person in that courtroom who had walked in believing Ryden Price's story of a broken man deserving sympathy was now watching that story burn to ash in real time. And Amelia Gallagher, the woman they'd quietly pitied an hour earlier, was still sitting exactly where she'd been the entire time. Calm, composed, and no longer invisible. The recess stretched past its 15 minutes, and nobody in the hallway seemed to mind. Reporters who'd wandered in that morning expecting a routine divorce hearing were now huddled near the elevators, thumbs flying across their phones, feeding a story that hadn't even finished happening yet. Amelia stood near the same window as before, Denise beside her, both women watching the corridor rather than the parking lot now because the corridor was where the real second act was unfolding. Ryden and Wexler had claimed a side conference room down the hall, door shut, blinds drawn, but the walls in a county courthouse were thin enough that raised voices carried anyway. "You told me this was clean." Ryden's voice cracked through the door, muffled but unmistakable. "You told me the accounts were untraceable." "I told you what your own people told me," Wexler shot back, his composure finally slipping. "If Rothschild's team found this in 5 months, Ryden, it means it was never as buried as you thought. This isn't a negotiation anymore. This is exposure. So fix it." "There's nothing to fix. You need to understand what's coming. If the judge refers this to federal prosecutors, we're not talking about a support modification anymore. We're talking about wire fraud, asset concealment during divorce proceedings, possibly tax evasion depending on how those Luxembourg accounts were structured. I need you to think very carefully before you say another word in that courtroom." Amelia listened without meaning to, without trying, because the door wasn't thick enough to stop it, and some small, tired part of her wanted to hear him panic. She'd spent 11 years listening to that voice tell her everything was fine, that she was overreacting, that trust was something she owed him unconditionally, while he apparently owed her nothing but a story. Denise touched her elbow lightly. "Don't let it get to you. We've got what we need. The rest is procedure now." "I'm not upset," Amelia said quietly. "I'm just remembering." "Remembering what?" "How many times he used that exact tone with me. Fix it, handle it, like I was a problem on a spreadsheet instead of a person he made promises to." She exhaled slowly, watching a custodian push a cart of files down the far end of the hallway, unaware he was walking through the epicenter of someone's entire life rearranging itself. "I used to think if I just asked the right question the right way, he'd finally tell me the truth. I used to lie awake rehearsing how to ask so he wouldn't get defensive. Isn't that ridiculous? I spent years managing his feelings about his own lies." "It's not ridiculous," Denise said. "It's what happens to smart, capable women who marry men who need someone smaller than them to feel big. It's common. It's not weakness. And it's ending today." Down the hall, the conference room door opened and Wexler stepped out first, jaw tight, motioning for a court officer. Ryden followed a moment later, and for just a fraction of a second, before he composed his face again, Amelia caught something raw underneath the practiced defeat. Real fear, unguarded. And ugly. The look of a man realizing the floor beneath him had been made of glass the whole time, and he'd just heard the first crack. Their eyes met across the hallway. He didn't look away first this time. Neither did she. "You think this makes you look strong?" he said low, just for her stepping close enough that Denise stiffened and moved half a step forward instinctively. "Parading some billionaire in there like he's your knight in shining armor. Everyone's going to know exactly what this is, Amelia. A bitter woman who couldn't build anything herself, latching on to whoever's willing to fund her revenge." "Mr. Price," Denise said sharply, "you need to step back from my client right now." Ryden ignored her eyes, still locked on Amelia. "You think Nathaniel Rothschild cares about you men like that don't fall for women like you. You're a project, a cause. The second this is over, he's gone and you'll be exactly what you've always been. Alone." Amelia felt the old reflex rise in her chest, the one trained into her over 11 years, the urge to shrink, to apologize, to smooth things over so he wouldn't get louder. She let it rise, and then for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let it pass through her without taking hold. "You spent 11 years telling me who I was," she said, voice even quiet enough that only he and Denise could hear it, steady enough that it didn't waver once. "I believed you for most of them, but I'm done letting you write my story, Ryden. In about 10 minutes, a judge is going to read 22 million reasons why your version of events was never true. So no, I don't think this makes me look strong. I know it makes you look exactly like what you are." Something flickered across his face, something between fury and disbelief, the specific expression of a man encountering resistance from a source he'd trained himself to believe had none left. Before he could respond, the bailiff called out that court was resuming, and the moment dissolved into the shuffle of people heading back through the double doors. Brittany hadn't left her seat during the recess. She sat alone at the defense table, arms wrapped around herself, mascara smudged beneath her eyes, staring at nothing. When Ryden approached, she flinched away from him. "Don't," she said. "Don't sit next to me right now." "Brittany, listen to me. I called my sister during the break," she said, voice trembling but sharpening with each word. "I have her lawyer's number, my own lawyer, because apparently I need one now, Ryden, because apparently you put my name on accounts I didn't even know existed." "I was protecting you," Ryden said, and even Amelia, hearing it from several feet away, could tell it was the first fully honest sentence he'd said all morning, honest in its desperation if nothing else. "If everything came out in my name alone, they'd have taken it all immediately. I needed a buffer. You needed a buffer," Brittany repeated, voice climbing. "So you used me. You put my name on $4 million of stolen money, and you didn't think that was something I deserved to know about. It's not stolen, it's restructured. It's fraud, Ryden." The man just said the word fraud in front of a judge. Her voice cracked into something close to hysteria, drawing glances from the gallery, from the bailiff, from Judge Harmon himself, as he retook the bench. "I have a nursing license. Do you understand what happens to a nursing license when your name is attached to a federal fraud case? I could lose everything. Everything I actually built myself." "Ms. Carmichael," the judge said, not unkindly but firmly, "I understand this is distressing, but I need you to lower your voice in my courtroom." Brittany pressed a shaking hand over her mouth, nodding, tears sliding freely now, ruining what was left of her carefully applied makeup. The ring on her finger, so bright and triumphant 2 hours earlier, now looked like exactly what it was evidence. The judge waited until the room settled fully before speaking again, his tone carrying the particular weight of a man who had in his decades on the bench seen exactly this kind of unraveling before, and knew precisely how dangerous it could become if he let emotion run the room instead of procedure. "Mr. Rothschild," he said, "you may step down, but I'll ask you to remain available should further testimony be required. Ms. Okafor, do you have additional witnesses or documentation?" "We do, Your Honor," Denise said, rising. "At this time, I'd like to call our lead forensic accountant, Dr. Priya Nandan, to walk the court through the full scope of the concealment structure." Wexler stood immediately, though, with noticeably less fight in him than an hour earlier. "Your Honor, given the developments of the past 30 minutes, the defense would request a short continuance to allow proper review of Denied, Counselor," the judge said, not unkindly, but without room for negotiation. "You've had ample notice this morning, and given the seriousness of what's been presented, I have no intention of delaying this proceeding while assets potentially continue moving. Proceed, Ms. Okafor." Dr. Priya Nandan approached the witness stand with the brisk efficiency of someone who spent her professional life translating chaos into columns. She was sworn in, seated, and Denise wasted no time. "Dr. Nandan, can you describe your role in this investigation?" "I lead the forensic accounting division that reviewed Price Industries' financial records cross-referenced with the offshore documentation provided by Mr. Rothschild's team," she said, opening a tablet, pulling up a chart that mirrored onto the courtroom screen. "Our findings identified a pattern that began approximately 20 months ago, roughly 2 months before Mrs. Gallagher filed for divorce. Please walk the court through the pattern." "Certainly." Dr. Nandan gestured to the screen where a timeline appeared marked with dates and dollar figures. In month 1, a shell entity called Meridian Holdings Group was registered in the Cayman Islands. Mr. Price is listed as a beneficial owner through a nominee director structure, meaning his name doesn't appear directly on public filings, but banking correspondence obtained through subpoena confirms his direct control. And what happened after that entity was established? Over the following 4 months, 3 separate transfers totaling $6.2 million moved from Price Industries' primary operating account into Meridian Holdings, each labeled internally as strategic consulting fees, paid to an entity that upon investigation has no employees, no physical office, and no verifiable business activity beyond receiving these transfers. A ripple moved through the gallery. Amelia kept her eyes on the screen on the numbers, letting them anchor her, instead of the memory trying to surface the memory of Ryden telling her during that exact window of months that they needed to tighten the belt, that her request for a family vacation was not realistic right now given the market. "Continue, please," Denise said. Approximately 3 months later, a second entity, Castellan Trust, was formed in Luxembourg. This entity received an additional $9.1 million, transferred in smaller increments over several months, structured specifically to avoid triggering automatic reporting thresholds with banking compliance systems. This is a technique known as structuring, and it's generally considered strong evidence of intentional concealment rather than legitimate business activity. And the remaining funds Mr. Rothschild referenced, the $22 million total. The remaining amount was distributed across 4 additional smaller entities, along with the direct transfers into accounts under Ms. Carmichael's name that Mr. Rothschild described earlier, Dr. Nandon said. In total, our team has traced funds moving through 6 distinct shell structures, all converging back to Mr. Price as the ultimate beneficial owner, all timed in a pattern consistent with deliberate concealment ahead of a known divorce filing. Wexler rose visibly, trying to recover some ground. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is characterizing intent, which is a legal conclusion, not a financial one." "Sustained in part," the judge said. "Dr. Nandon, please limit your testimony to the financial findings themselves." "Of course, Your Honor," Dr. Nandon said smoothly, unbothered. "I'll simply note that the timing and structuring methodology are consistent with patterns our firm has identified in prior asset concealment cases. I'll leave the legal characterization to the court." It was a careful answer, technically compliant, but everyone in the room understood exactly what she meant anyway. The judge's expression suggested he understood it perfectly too. Ryden had gone very still in his chair, staring at the numbers on the screen like a man watching his own autopsy performed in real time. Wexler leaned close, whispering something urgent, and Ryden shook his head slightly. Jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped visibly along his cheek. "Dr. Nandon," Denise continued, "based on your review, is there any indication these funds have been used or spent, or are they still accessible? Based on the most recent banking records, our team was able to obtain approximately $18.3 million of the $22 million remains in liquid form across the 6 entities. The remaining amount appears to have been used for specific purchases we've been able to identify. Can you elaborate on those purchases?" Dr. Nandon tapped her tablet, and a new set of records populated the screen. "Yes. Approximately $2.6 million was used to purchase a beachfront property in the Turks and Caicos Islands, registered under a holding company connected to Meridian Holdings. Records show the property was purchased 4 months ago." Denise let a small pause sit before her next question, timing it deliberately. "Do you know who currently occupies that property, or for what purpose it was purchased?" According to a rental and staffing agency contracted for the property, it's been designated as a private residence currently being prepared for what internal correspondence refers to as the wedding. The word landed in the courtroom like a dropped glass. Brittany's head snapped up. "What wedding, Ryden? What is she talking about?" "Brittany, that's not. We haven't even set a date yet. You told me you hadn't found anything you liked, that everything was too expensive right now because of the company." Her voice broke entirely, the pieces of her composure that had survived the last hour finally giving way completely. Oh my God, you had this planned for months. You bought a house for our wedding with stolen money and told me you couldn't afford a caterer." "It wasn't stolen, it was—" Ryden started, but even he seemed to hear how hollow the word restructured sounded now, and he didn't finish the sentence. "Order," the judge said, though with less force than before, as if even he understood the outburst was less a courtroom disruption and more a woman's entire understanding of her own life quietly detonating in real time. He let it settle for a moment before continuing. "Ms. Okafor, please continue." Denise nodded, turning back to the witness. "Dr. Nandon, one final question. In your professional opinion, based on the totality of these findings, could Mr. Price have plausibly believed Price Industries was insolvent as claimed in his financial disclosure to this court?" "No," Dr. Nandon said simply without hesitation. The company's actual liquid position when accounting for these transfers exceeds $26 million. That is not insolvency. That is concealment. Thank you, Dr. Nandan. Nothing further, Your Honor. The judge turned to Wexler. Cross-examination counselor. Wexler stood slowly, clearly searching for any foothold and finding very little. Dr. Nandan, is it possible these entities were established for legitimate international business expansion, and the documentation simply hasn't caught up with legal filing requirements? It's theoretically possible, Dr. Nandan said evenly, though I'd note that legitimate business expansion typically doesn't involve nominee directors, specifically structured to obscure beneficial ownership transfers, deliberately sized to avoid compliance reporting thresholds, or the acquisition of a private residence explicitly designated for a personal wedding rather than any business purpose. A few muffled laughs rippled through the gallery before the bailiff's glance silenced them. Wexler's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. "No further questions, Your Honor," he said, sitting back down with the resigned posture of a man who'd stopped trying to win and started trying to survive. The judge made a note, then looked up, addressing the room at large. "Given the scope of what's been presented today, I'm going to take a 15-minute recess before we proceed to closing matters. I want to be very clear with both parties." His eyes moved to Ryden direct and unflinching. "Mr. Price, based on the evidence presented today, I have significant concerns that extend well beyond this civil matter. I intend to refer this case, along with all supporting documentation, to federal authorities for review of potential wire fraud and asset concealment violations. I'd encourage you to retain separate criminal counsel immediately because Mr. Wexler's expertise, as skilled as it may be, does not appear to extend to that arena." The gavel came down and the room dissolved into noise again, murmurs rising into full conversation. Someone near the back, already on the phone, describing the hearing to whoever was on the other end. Brittany had buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking, and when Ryden reached toward her again, she stood abruptly and walked to the opposite end of the defense table, putting as much physical distance between them as the small space allowed. Amelia sat very still through the noise, watching it all with a strange floating clarity, like she was observing someone else's life through glass. Denise leaned toward her. "How are you holding up?" "Honestly," Amelia said, "I don't know yet. It doesn't feel real. $26 million. He let our daughter cry about braces over $26 million. "I know," Denise said quietly, "but Amelia, listen to me. This isn't just about the money anymore. Federal referral means this becomes public record in a much bigger way. Reporters are already outside. Once this gets picked up beyond the local paper, it's going to move fast. I need you prepared for that." Amelia nodded slowly, absorbing it. "What about Nathaniel? Why did he really do all this?" "You still haven't told me the full reason a stranger spent 5 months building a case for me." Denise hesitated, glancing toward the back of the courtroom where Nathaniel stood near the exit, speaking quietly with one of his own associates. Unhurried, entirely composed a man, clearly accustomed to storms he hadn't personally caused settling around him. That, Denise said, might be a question better suited for him. But I'll tell you this much. When his team first flagged the irregularities, standard procedure would have been to simply report it to relevant financial authorities and let the system handle it on its own timeline, which frankly could have taken years. He didn't do that. He specifically asked to accelerate everything to align with your hearing date. He said, and I'm quoting him directly here, "She's waited long enough. She doesn't need to wait for bureaucracy too." Something in Amelia's chest tightened, unexpected and unwelcome in its intensity. She wasn't ready to examine why those particular words landed the way they did. Not here, not in the middle of the worst and most vindicating morning of her adult life. She filed the feeling away, the way she'd learned to file away so many feelings over the years, promising herself she'd return to it later when there was room. The recess ended, and the room settled back into its tense rhythm. Ryden had regained some composure, though it sat differently on him now, less performance and more raw calculation, the look of a man doing rapid math on how much of his life could still be salvaged. "Your Honor," Wexler said, rising once more, voice noticeably more subdued. "Given the gravity of what's been presented, my client would like to request a brief private conference with opposing counsel to discuss potential resolution outside of continued proceedings." The judge looked toward Denise. Ms. Okafor, is your client open to that? Denise glanced at Amelia, a silent question in her eyes. Amelia considered it for a long moment. Part of her wanted to refuse outright, wanted to watch this play out publicly to its absolute end, wanted every person in that gallery to witness every remaining second of Ryden's collapse. But another part of her, quieter and more practical, understood that a private conference didn't mean mercy. It meant leverage, and leverage used correctly could secure more for her children's future than pure spectacle ever would. "I'm open to it," Amelia said quietly, "but nothing changes about what happens with the fraud referral. That's not negotiable." "Understood," Denise said, then addressed the court. "We're amenable to a brief conference, Your Honor, with the understanding that any private discussion does not affect the court's stated intention regarding federal referral." "Agreed," the judge said. 30 minutes. Use them wisely, counselors." The two legal teams moved toward a side room, Ryden trailing behind Wexler, with none of his earlier bravado shoulders slightly hunched, now a man walking toward a conversation he clearly dreaded. Amelia remained in the hallway with Denise for a moment before following, and it was there in that brief window that Nathaniel approached them directly for the first time since he'd stepped down from the witness stand. "Mrs. Gallagher," he said, his voice as steady in person as it had been on the stand, though something softer moved beneath it now, something almost careful. "I hope it's all right that I stayed." "Of course," Amelia said, studying him properly for the first time up close, without a courtroom's distance between them. There was an ease to him that felt unfamiliar. After 11 years of Ryden's carefully managed performances, nothing about Nathaniel seemed calculated for effect. He simply was who he was, and that more than the $22 million unsettled her slightly. "I owe you a real conversation, not just gratitude, though there's plenty of that too. I need to understand why you did this." "There'll be time for that conversation," Nathaniel said. "When you're ready. Today isn't about me. Today's about you walking out of that room in there with everything you're owed." He glanced toward the side conference room where muffled voices had already started to rise. "For what it's worth, I don't think he's going to make this easy even now. Men like that rarely surrender gracefully. They negotiate right up until the floor gives out beneath them." "You sound like you've seen this before," Amelia said. "More times than I'd like." Nathaniel said something briefly shadowed, crossing his expression before it smoothed away again. "It's part of why I do the work I do." Before Amelia could ask what he meant, Denise touched her arm gently. "We should go in. They're waiting." Amelia nodded, and as she turned toward the conference room, Nathaniel added quiet enough that only she caught it. "Whatever he offers you in there, don't let old habits make you settle for less than what the truth has already proven you're owed. You've spent enough of your life being talked into smaller numbers." The words followed her through the door. Inside the small conference room, Ryden sat across the table, Wexler beside him, both men looking considerably smaller than they had appeared from across a courtroom aisle. Denise took the seat beside Amelia, opening a legal pad pen poised, giving nothing away. "Let's not waste anyone's time," Wexler began. "My client is prepared to offer a full and immediate settlement of $18 million transferred directly to Mrs. Gallagher, along with full custody arrangements, as previously discussed, in exchange for a joint statement to the court, indicating this matter has been amicably resolved and a request that the federal referral be withdrawn." "Withdrawn," Denise repeated flatly. "You understand that's not something my client controls. The judge referred this matter based on evidence, not based on a private agreement between the parties." "We understand the referral itself may proceed regardless," Wexler said carefully, "but a joint statement characterizing this as resolved without ongoing hostility from Mrs. Gallagher specifically could meaningfully influence how aggressively prosecutors choose to pursue the matter, especially combined with full restitution." Amelia listened to the exchange with a strange detachment, watching Ryden's face rather than Wexler's mouth. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the table jaw, tight hands, folded in a posture that might have looked like calm to anyone who hadn't spent 11 years learning what his stillness actually meant. It meant he was furious. It meant he was humiliated. It meant more than anything that he still believed somewhere beneath all of it that he could negotiate his way out of consequences the same way he'd negotiated his way through their entire marriage. 18 million. Amelia said quietly, and every head in the room turned toward her. Out of 26. You're offering me 18 out of 26 and asking me to help you soften a federal fraud investigation on top of it. Amelia, Ryden said, finally looking up, and for a moment, something in his voice sounded almost like the man she'd married before she reminded herself how many times that particular tone had preceded a lie. This doesn't need to get uglier than it already has. Think about the kids. Think about them having to watch their father go through a criminal trial on the news. You should have thought about them, Amelia said, voice steady. Before you hid $22 million while telling your daughter braces were a luxury we couldn't afford. Don't put their names in your mouth right now. You lost that right the moment I found out about the beachfront house. Ryden flinched, actually flinched, and Wexler shifted uncomfortably beside him. Mrs. Gallagher, Wexler said softer now, clearly recognizing the ground shifting beneath his own strategy. I understand the anger. But practically speaking, a protracted federal case could take years. Assets could remain frozen during that time. An immediate settlement guarantees you funds now for your children without the uncertainty of a lengthy legal process. Denise leaned forward slightly. My client is aware of the risks and benefits of both paths, counselor. But let's be precise about what's actually on the table. You're offering $18 million against a documented $26 million in identified assets, while asking her to publicly soften the very fraud that's been proven in open court an hour ago. That's not a settlement. That's asking her to discount justice for convenience. The room went quiet. Amelia looked at Ryden directly, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel the old pull to make things easier for him to smooth the edges, to protect him from the consequences of his own choices, the way she'd spent 11 years protecting him from awkward silences at dinner parties and difficult conversations with investors. I'll tell you what I want, she said. I want the full $26 million, not 18. I want full custody with supervised visitation only given what's been established today about your judgment and honesty. And I want zero involvement in softening anything related to the federal case, because frankly, Ryden, I think you should face exactly what you built. You'd really do that? Ryden said something between disbelief and genuine hurt in his voice. After everything, you'd really let them take everything from me. Prison. All of it. You did that, Amelia said. I didn't put your name on shell companies. I didn't buy a wedding house with stolen money while telling our children we couldn't afford summer camp. You built every piece of this, Ryden. I just finally stopped pretending I couldn't see it. Wexler cleared his throat, clearly recognizing there was no version of this conversation that ended in his client's favor today. Perhaps we table the settlement discussion and allow the court to proceed as scheduled. We can revisit terms once the immediate matters are resolved. That's acceptable, Denise said. Ryden said nothing more. He simply sat there staring at the table again, and Amelia realized watching him that this was likely the first time in his entire adult life he'd sat across from a table where he held absolutely no leverage at all. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like watching a building finally finish collapsing after everyone had already evacuated, inevitable, necessary, and strangely quiet at the center of it. They filed back into the courtroom a few minutes later, and the gallery, which had thinned only slightly during the extended recess, straightened with renewed attention as the parties retook their seats. The judge reviewed a note passed to him by his clerk before addressing the room. I understand the parties met privately and were unable to reach a comprehensive resolution, he said. We'll proceed with the remainder of today's hearing accordingly. Denise rose. Your Honor, given the scope of evidence presented, my client requests the court issue an immediate order freezing all identified assets connected to Price Industries and the associated shell entities pending full resolution of both this civil matter and any forthcoming criminal proceedings. Wexler stood, though, with visibly diminished conviction. Your Honor, an immediate freeze of this scale would be extraordinarily disruptive to Mr. Wexler, the judge said, cutting him off, not unkindly but with clear finality. Your client testified this morning that his company was functionally insolvent. Forensic evidence has since established that same company holds in excess of $26 million in concealed assets. I don't think disruptive is a word that carries much weight in this context. Motion granted. He picked up his pen, signing something with brisk, decisive strokes. Effective immediately, all accounts associated with Price Industries Meridian Holdings, Castellan Trust, and the 4 additional entities identified in today's testimony are ordered frozen pending further proceedings. I'm also formally referring this matter, along with the complete evidentiary record from today's hearing, to the U.S. Attorney's Office for review of potential federal fraud charges. The gavel came down, and this time the sound felt different, less like punctuation, and more like a door closing on an entire chapter of Amelia's life. Ryden sat motionless through it, staring straight ahead, and beside him, Brittany had gone quiet too. The earlier hysteria burned out into something flatter and more exhausted, the look of someone who understood the party was over, and had been for hours. She simply hadn't wanted to admit it until the judge said the word federal out loud with a gavel to punctuate it. We'll reconvene in 3 weeks to finalize remaining custody and support arrangements pending the outcome of the asset freeze and any related federal proceedings, the judge said. This hearing is adjourned. The room dissolved into motion, reporters pressing toward the exits to file whatever they'd already half written in their heads, spectators murmuring to one another, the specific electric hum of people who'd just witnessed something they'd be describing to friends and family for weeks. Ryden remained seated, even after Wexler stood staring at nothing until his attorney finally touched his shoulder and murmured something that finally got him moving slowly, unsteadily, toward the exit doors like a man walking out of a building that was still on fire behind him. Brittany followed a few steps back alone now, in every way that mattered, the diamond on her hand no longer catching the light the way it had that morning. Nobody in the gallery looked at her with envy anymore. A few looked at her with something closer to pity, and one older woman near the aisle actually reached out and patted her arm gently as she passed, murmuring something too quiet to hear. Brittany didn't stop walking. Amelia remained at the plaintiff's table a moment longer, Denise gathering papers beside her, and it was only then in the relative quiet after the storm that the full weight of the morning began to settle into her chest, not as triumph. Exactly, though there was some of that buried in it, but as something closer to grief for the 11 years she'd spent believing a smaller version of her own worth. "You did it," Denise said softly, watching her. "We did it," Amelia corrected. "No," Denise said, shaking her head slightly. "I presented evidence. You survived 11 years of being lied to and still had the strength to notice when something didn't add up. Still kept records he told you not to bother with, still walked into that courtroom this morning looking like you'd already lost when you knew exactly what was coming. That wasn't luck, Amelia. That was you." Outside the courtroom doors in the hallway, now filling with reporters angling for statements, Amelia caught sight of Nathaniel again, standing near the far wall, giving her space, rather than crowding the moment, watching with the same quiet, steady attention he'd carried through the entire hearing. She didn't know yet what his presence in her life actually meant, whether it was gratitude misfiring into something warmer, or the beginning of something she wasn't ready to name. But she knew, walking toward those doors with her head up for the first time in longer than she could remember, that whatever came next, she was walking into it as herself, fully seen, no longer negotiating for scraps of a truth someone else controlled. Behind her, somewhere in the emptying courtroom, Ryden Price sat for one last moment in the chair, where his entire carefully constructed life had come apart, in under 2 hours staring at nothing, finally understanding that the woman he'd spent 11 years convincing himself was small had simply been waiting patiently for the truth to finally be strong enough to speak for itself. 3 weeks felt like a strange kind of purgatory, the specific waiting that comes after a storm has already done its damage, but before anyone's allowed to start cleaning up. Amelia spent those weeks in a rhythm that felt almost foreign after 14 months of legal grinding mornings with her children, afternoons fielding calls from Denise's office about frozen accounts and federal timelines, evenings sitting alone in the kitchen of the small rental house she'd moved into after the separation, staring at nothing, trying to let her body catch up with what her mind already understood. It was over. The lie was over. She just didn't fully believe it yet. The story had moved faster than any of them expected. By the second day, a local news outlet had picked up the courtroom footage someone had illegally recorded on their phone, the clip of Brittany screaming about her nursing license spreading across social media with a speed that made Amelia's stomach turn every time her phone buzzed with another notification. By the fourth day, a financial journalist from a national outlet had requested comment, and by the end of the first week, Price Industries was trending under a hashtag that made Amelia physically close her laptop and not open it again for 3 days. Her daughter Maddie, 16 and sharp enough to notice everything, found her sitting at the kitchen table one evening, scrolling through headlines despite her own promise not to. "You need to stop reading that stuff, Mom," Maddie said, sliding into the chair across from her, arms crossed in the particular way that meant she'd rehearsed the sentence before saying it. "I know," Amelia said, closing the laptop for real this time. "Dad called me again today," Maddie said, carefully watching her mother's face for a reaction. "He wants to see us this weekend. Says everything's a misunderstanding, that Mr. Rothschild guy has some kind of vendetta against him, and it's all going to get sorted out." Amelia kept her expression neutral, though something tightened behind her ribs. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I saw the video of Brittany having a full meltdown in a courtroom about a nursing license, and that seemed like a weird thing for a misunderstanding to cause." Maddie's voice cracked slightly at the edges, the bravado thinning to reveal the 14 months of confusion underneath it. "Mom, is it true? Did he really hide that much money while telling us we couldn't afford stuff?" Amelia reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "It's true, sweetheart. I'm not going to lie to you about any of it, even though I know it's a lot to hear." Maddie was quiet for a long moment, jaw tight, eyes bright with the kind of tears a 16-year-old works hard not to let fall in front of her mother. "I asked him for braces money 2 years ago. He said we couldn't afford it. I remember exactly what he said. He said, 'Maddie, money doesn't grow on trees. You need to understand the value of a dollar.'" She laughed short and bitter. Nothing like her usual laugh. $26 million, Mom. He said that to me over $26 million. "I know," Amelia said quietly, and there wasn't anything else to say that wouldn't sound hollow against a number that large. "Are we going to be okay?" Maddie asked, and for a moment she sounded much younger than 16, sounded like the little girl who used to climb into Amelia's lap during thunderstorms. "We're going to be more than okay," Amelia said, and meant it with a certainty that surprised her. "I promise you that." Denise called the next morning with an update that confirmed the certainty had teeth behind it. "The federal prosecutor's office has opened a formal investigation," she said. "They're moving fast. Amelia, faster than these things usually go, which tells me they think the evidence is strong enough to make an example. I got a call from an assistant U.S. attorney named Diane Kessler. She wants to interview you next week as part of building their case." "Me, I don't know anything about the accounts, Denise. I never even saw them." "That's exactly why they want to talk to you," Denise said. "They need testimony establishing the timeline of what he told you versus what was actually happening. Your statements about the summer camp, the braces, the vacations he claimed you couldn't afford, that's not just emotional context, Amelia. That's evidence of intent. It shows he was actively constructing a false financial narrative for you, specifically which supports the fraud charges beyond just the paper trail." Amelia absorbed that feeling. Something shifted inside her. The recognition that her years of small humiliations, the ones she'd carried privately and never fully spoken aloud even to herself, were about to become part of an official record, part of the proof. "There's something else," Denise continued, her voice shifting into a register Amelia had learned to recognize as caution. "Ryden's retained a criminal defense attorney, Marcus Chen, out of Atlanta. He's expensive and he's good, which tells me Ryden still has access to funds we haven't identified yet, or someone's fronting the cost for him. Who would front that kind of money for him now?" "That," Denise said, "is a very good question and I don't have an answer yet, but I want you prepared for the possibility that this isn't as clean and finished as it felt walking out of that courtroom 3 weeks ago. Men like Ryden don't usually go down quietly. They look for angles. And right now, cornered the way he is, he's going to be looking hard." Amelia thought about that conversation for the rest of the day, turning it over while she picked her son Eli up from soccer practice, while she made dinner, while she sat on the porch afterward watching the sky go orange and then gray, and she found herself, not for the first time in 3 weeks, thinking about Nathaniel Rothschild. He'd texted twice since the hearing. Brief, respectful messages, checking in without pushing, offering nothing more than space and the occasional practical update from his own legal team's monitoring of the frozen accounts. She'd responded warmly, but carefully aware of a pull she wasn't ready to examine too closely, not while the dust from her marriage was still settling around her feet. On the fourth week, that carefulness ran directly into a wall because Ryden Price didn't wait for the dust to settle at all. It started with a phone call at 7 a.m., Amelia's cell buzzing on the nightstand while she was still half asleep, an unknown number she almost let go to voicemail before some instinct made her answer. "Mrs. Gallagher, this is Detective Ruiz with the County Sheriff's Office. I'm sorry to call so early, but I need to ask you some questions regarding a report filed against you." Amelia sat straight up in bed, heart suddenly hammering. "A report? What kind of report?" "Your ex-husband, Ryden Price, filed a complaint yesterday alleging that you removed items from the marital residence without authorization, specifically referencing some jewelry and personal documents. He's requesting we investigate potential theft." Amelia's mouth went dry with disbelief so complete it took her a moment to find words. "Detective, I haven't set foot in that house in 14 months. I have court documentation establishing the separation timeline. I moved out with exactly what the court allowed me to take, itemized and verified by both attorneys at the time." "I understand this may be frustrating," Detective Ruiz said, his tone suggesting he'd already half suspected as much. "We're required to follow up on any filed complaint, but if you can have your attorney forward that documentation, it should resolve this quickly." She called Denise the second she hung up, voice tight with a fury she was working hard to keep controlled. "He's harassing me, 14 months separated, and now suddenly I'm a jewel thief." "It's a nuisance tactic," Denise said, though Amelia could hear the edge in her own voice too, the recognition of a pattern forming. "He's testing what he can throw at you to see what sticks or what distracts. I'll get the documentation over to the sheriff's office within the hour. This'll die immediately. But Amelia, I need you to log everything. Every call, every message, every strange thing that happens from here forward. If this is the start of a pattern, we need the paper trail." It was the start of a pattern. 2 days later, Amelia's employer, a marketing firm she'd worked at part-time since the separation began, received an anonymous email alleging she'd falsified her timesheet records, an accusation so specific and so absurd that her supervisor actually laughed when relaying it to her. But the laughter didn't fully erase the unease underneath. Someone had gone looking for a way to hurt her professionally. Someone had spent time crafting language designed to sound credible. 3 days after that, Maddie came home from school in tears, having overheard 2 classmates repeating a rumor apparently sourced from Brittany's Instagram before her account went private, claiming Amelia had been unfaithful during the marriage, and that the divorce had actually been Ryden's decision, not hers, framed as him finally standing up to a manipulative wife. "It's not true, right, Mom?" Maddie asked, even though she clearly already knew it wasn't needing to hear. It said aloud anyway, needing the ground under her to hold. "None of it is true," Amelia said, holding her daughter while she cried, feeling something harden inside her chest that hadn't been there 3 weeks earlier. Something less patient, less willing to simply absorb whatever Ryden decided to throw. She called Nathaniel that night later than she meant to, nearly 10 o'clock, but the anger and exhaustion had worn down whatever hesitation she'd been carrying. "He's coming after me," she said the moment he picked up no preamble. "Fake police reports, lies to my employer, rumors targeting my daughter at school. He spent 3 weeks building a smear campaign instead of preparing a defense." Nathaniel's voice when he responded carried none of the calm detachment she'd noted in the courtroom. This was sharper, more immediate. "Tell me everything, all of it from the beginning." She did, laying out each incident in order, and she could hear something shifting on his end of the line as she spoke, the particular quiet of a man doing calculations, weighing options, deciding on a response. "This ends now," Nathaniel said when she finished. "Amelia, listen to me. I want you to document every single thing exactly the way you just told me, dates, times, sources if you have them, and send it to Denise first thing tomorrow. But I also want to loop in someone from my own team. We have investigators who specialize in exactly this kind of harassment pattern. And frankly, given what's already been established about Ryden's willingness to falsify documentation, I think this crosses directly into witness intimidation territory, especially with the federal case pending. Witness intimidation, Nathaniel, I'm not a witness in a criminal case, I'm his ex-wife. You're a material witness in the federal investigation into his assets, Nathaniel said. Prosecutor Kessler is building a case that specifically relies on your testimony about what he told you regarding the company's finances. If he's engaged in a coordinated effort to discredit you before that testimony happens, that's not just petty ex-husband behavior. That's a man trying to compromise a federal witness. And if I'm right, that's going to land considerably harder on him than the original fraud charges. Amelia sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling in slowly. You think he's smart enough to be doing this deliberately? Ryden's not exactly a strategic thinker, Nathaniel. He's arrogant, but he's not clever. No, Nathaniel agreed, which tells me someone's advising him, and I have a guess who. Wexler. Wexler's a civil attorney, and not a particularly aggressive one from what I've seen. This feels like something else. A pause waited careful. I've had my team keeping an eye on Price Industries' remaining unfrozen assets, small accounts that fell outside the initial court order. 2 days ago, $40,000 moved out of one of those accounts to a private investigation firm out of Savannah, one with a reputation for exactly this kind of work. Digging up dirt, manufacturing narratives applying pressure on witnesses right up to the edge of what's technically legal. He's paying people to destroy my credibility before I can testify. That's my read, Nathaniel said, and I think we should let Kessler know immediately. This isn't just useful for protecting you, Amelia. This is additional evidence of consciousness of guilt. Innocent men don't spend $40,000 trying to discredit the ex-wife who's about to testify against them. The call to Kessler happened the next morning. A conference call with Denise Amelia and the assistant U.S. attorney's clipped, efficient voice, cutting through with the particular energy of someone who'd just been handed a gift she hadn't expected. "This is extremely helpful, Mrs. Gallagher," Kessler said. "We'll be adding a review of these harassment incidents and the private investigator payment to our existing evidence package. I want to be direct with you. Cases like this often move slowly. But a pattern of witness intimidation tends to accelerate things considerably, both because it strengthens our position and because it demonstrates urgency to the grand jury." "Grand jury," Amelia repeated. "How soon?" "We're moving to present to the grand jury within the next 3 weeks," Kessler said. "I'd like to schedule your formal interview for this Thursday if that works for your schedule. I want your account on record before anything else happens." Thursday arrived with a strange, nervous energy that reminded Amelia uncomfortably of the morning of the courtroom hearing, that same sense of standing at the edge of something that would look different on the other side of it. The federal building was colder and more sterile than the county courthouse, all clean lines and quiet hallways, and Kessler herself turned out to be a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who conducted the interview with a precision that felt almost soothing after weeks of chaos. "Walk me through a specific example," Kessler said 2 hours into the interview, "of a time your husband told you the company was struggling financially, and be as detailed as you can about the timing." Amelia thought back, letting the memory surface fully, instead of pushing it away the way she usually did. "About 18 months ago, right around when the forensic records show that First Shell Company was established, I asked him if we could take the kids to visit my sister in Colorado for spring break. It wasn't extravagant. Just flights and a week at her place. He told me the company was bleeding cash and that we needed to be careful. I remember him using that exact phrase, bleeding cash. He said it while wearing a watch I later found out cost $11,000. Kessler made a note, unhurried. "And you believed him at the time?" "I had no reason not to," Amelia said. "He controlled all the financial information in our marriage. I signed documents when he told me to. I trusted him because that's what 11 years of marriage teaches you to do until it teaches you the opposite." "That's exactly the kind of testimony that matters here," Kessler said. "Juries understand numbers on a spreadsheet. What they connect with what actually moves a case is understanding the human cost of a lie. You canceling a trip to see your sister while he's buying an $11,000 watch. That's not abstract fraud, Mrs. Gallagher. That's a story people understand in their gut. The interview stretched nearly 4 hours, covering years of small moments Amelia had never expected to matter, each one a tiny brick in a wall Kessler was clearly building with great care. By the time it ended, Amelia felt hollowed out in a way that surprised her, not from grief exactly, but from the sheer volume of remembering of finally speaking aloud a version of her marriage she'd spent years minimizing even to herself. Nathaniel was waiting in the lobby when she came out, which she hadn't expected and hadn't asked him to do, and something in her chest loosened slightly at the sight of him standing there, unhurried, patient, exactly where he said he'd be. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," he said simply. "I wanted to." "How did it go?" "Exhausting," she admitted, and then because something about his steadiness made honesty easier than usual. "Also strange. I spent 4 hours talking about my marriage like it was a case file instead of my actual life. It's a weird thing hearing your own heartbreak get filed under evidence." "For what it's worth," Nathaniel said as they walked out into the afternoon light, "I don't think what you lived through stops being your life just because it's also useful as evidence. Both things can be true. It was real. It also matters now in a way that might actually help you." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Amelia, driven by 3 weeks of curiosity she'd been carefully not indulging, finally asked the question she'd been holding since the courtroom. "You still haven't told me why," she said. "Why you accelerated everything, why you personally testified instead of just handing evidence to prosecutors and letting the system work on its own timeline. Denise said you told her something about not wanting me to wait longer than I already had. What did that mean?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Amelia wondered if he'd answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual composure, something more personal bleeding through the careful professional register she'd come to associate with him. "My sister was married to a man very similar to Ryden," he said. "Different industry, different scale of money, but the same pattern. Control the finances, minimize her contributions, tell her she couldn't survive without him. It took her 9 years to leave, and by the time she did, he'd hidden enough assets that her settlement barely covered a security deposit on an apartment. The legal system moved so slowly that by the time anything was recovered years later, she'd already rebuilt her entire life from nothing, working 2 jobs, raising 2 kids largely alone. The money that eventually came through didn't undo any of that. It just arrived too late to matter the way it should have. "I'm sorry," Amelia said quietly. "When my team flagged the pattern in Price Industries' books," Nathaniel continued, "and I saw the timeline lining up with your divorce filing, I recognized it immediately, not intellectually, in my gut. I thought about my sister, about how much of her life she spent doubting herself because a system built to protect her moved too slowly to actually help. I didn't want that for you. I had the resources to move faster than the system usually allows, and I decided I wasn't going to sit on that just because it was more conventional to let bureaucracy handle it on its own schedule." Amelia felt something in her chest crack open slightly, an unexpected tenderness she hadn't anticipated feeling toward this careful, composed man who'd walked into her life through a courtroom door 3 weeks earlier. "That's not a small thing you did, Nathaniel. You gave me my life back years earlier than I would have gotten it otherwise." "You'd have gotten there eventually," he said. "You're clearly capable of it. I just didn't see any reason you should have to wait longer than necessary to prove what was already true." They'd reached the parking lot by then, and Amelia found herself reluctant to end the conversation. Reluctant in a way that felt unfamiliar after months of guarding herself carefully against exactly this kind of pull. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. I don't think I've said that properly yet." "You don't need to keep saying it," Nathaniel said, a small smile finally breaking through his usual composure. "Just let yourself actually live the life this clears the way for. That's thanks enough." Her phone buzzed before she could respond. Denise's name flashing on the screen, and something in the timing, in the specific urgency of a call arriving exactly as a private moment threatened to deepen into something more, made Amelia's stomach tighten with instinctive dread even before she answered. "Denise, what's wrong?" "I need you to sit down," Denise said, and the gravity in her voice confirmed the dread immediately. "Amelia Ryden's gone." Gone where? His passport was flagged this morning at Hartsfield-Jackson. He attempted to board a flight to a country with no extradition treaty with the United States using a private charter service roughly 4 hours ago. Federal agents intercepted him before boarding, but Amelia, he had 2 suitcases with him. One contained personal effects. The other contained approximately $300,000 in cash and a set of documents for a new identity. Amelia felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her Nathaniel's hand, steadying her elbow before she'd even registered swaying. He was trying to run, Denise confirmed, which means the federal case just went from serious to catastrophic for him. Flight risk during an active investigation, combined with what looks like preparation for identity fraud, essentially guarantees they'll seek detention without bail once formal charges are filed. Kessler's office called me the moment it happened. They want to move the grand jury presentation up, significantly. How significantly? 10 days, Denise said. Amelia, this is happening fast now, faster than any of us expected. I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that within a matter of weeks, Ryden Price isn't going to be dealing with a support hearing or an asset freeze anymore. He's going to be facing actual federal indictment, and given what just happened at that airport, likely without the option of walking free while it's litigated. Amelia stood in the parking lot, phone pressed to her ear, Nathaniel's steady presence beside her, the only thing keeping the moment from feeling entirely unreal. And she thought about Ryden's face in that courtroom 3 weeks earlier, the disbelief and fear flickering underneath his carefully constructed composure as Nathaniel's testimony dismantled everything he'd built his new life on. He hadn't been broken that day. She understood that now, standing in a federal parking lot, hearing about suitcases full of cash and false identities, he'd simply been buying time, looking for the exit the entire time, still believing right up until agents stopped him at a gate that he could outmaneuver consequences, the same way he'd outmaneuvered honesty for 18 months. He'd been wrong, and in 10 days the whole world was going to know exactly how wrong. Denise, Amelia said slowly, does this change my testimony timeline, the grand jury? It might mean we move faster than expected, Denise said. I'll know more by tomorrow, but Amelia, I need you ready for anything at this point. This man just showed us exactly how far he's willing to go, rather than face what's coming. I don't think we've seen the last unpredictable move from him. She was right. And though none of them knew it yet, standing in that parking lot with the afternoon light slanting gold across the pavement, the most unpredictable move of all was still 3 weeks away, waiting in a federal courtroom that would make Superior Courtroom 302 look like a quiet rehearsal for the reckoning still to come. 10 days moved like 10 years and 10 minutes. At the same time, that strange elastic quality, grief and anticipation, share when they're tangled together in the same chest. Amelia spent them in a blur of prep sessions with Kessler's office, quiet evenings with her children that she guarded fiercely, and phone calls with Denise that came at increasingly odd hours as the federal timeline accelerated beyond anyone's original expectations. Ryden had been released on a modified bail arrangement after the airport incident, a decision that had made Amelia's blood run cold when Denise first relayed it. Released. He had cash and a false identity in a suitcase, Denise. How is that person walking around free? His new criminal attorney, Marcus Chen, made an aggressive argument. Denise explained, her voice tight with the specific frustration of a lawyer watching another lawyer do exactly what he was paid to do. GPS monitoring surrendered passport weekly check-ins with pretrial services and a bail amount his family apparently found a way to cover despite the asset freeze. The judge in the criminal matter isn't the same one who heard your civil case. Different courtroom, different judge, different tolerance for risk, evidently. So he's just out there, living his life while I'm preparing testimony against him. He's out there with an ankle monitor and federal agents watching his every move, Denise said. It's not freedom, Amelia. It's a very expensive leash. And frankly, given what happened at the airport, I don't think Chen's done him any favors long term. Flight risk arguments tend to age very badly in front of a jury. The grand jury proceeding happened on a Tuesday, closed to the public, closed, even to Amelia, whose testimony had already been recorded and submitted as part of the evidentiary package Kessler's office assembled. She spent that day at home, unable to focus on anything, jumping every time her phone buzzed, until finally at 4:47 in the afternoon, Denise called with the news that shattered the strange suspended quiet of the past 10 days. They returned an indictment, Denise said, and Amelia could hear something in her voice that sounded almost like awe. Amelia, it's not just fraud and asset concealment anymore. They added wire fraud structuring to evade reporting requirements attempted flight to avoid prosecution, and this is the one that matters most for you witness tampering based on the harassment pattern and the private investigator payment we flagged 3 weeks ago. How many counts total? 14, Denise said. 14 federal counts, Amelia. If convicted on even half of these, we're talking about a sentencing range that could put him away for a very long time. This isn't a fine anymore. This isn't a settlement. This is prison. Amelia sat with the phone pressed to her ear, staring out the kitchen window, at nothing in particular, trying to let the numbers settle into something she could actually feel, rather than just understand abstractly. 14 counts. 11 years of marriage distilled down into 14 federal counts, each one a specific, provable lie. What happens now? She asked. Arraignment set for next week, Denise said. He'll be formally charged, enter a plea likely not guilty given Chen's reputation for fighting everything to trial. After that, we're looking at months of pretrial proceedings before an actual trial date, unless something changes that trajectory. Something did change the trajectory, though, not in the direction anyone expected, and it started with a phone call Amelia received 4 days later from a number she didn't recognize a call. She almost let go to voicemail before something made her answer. Mrs. Gallagher, this is Brittany Carmichael. Please don't hang up. Amelia's grip tightened on the phone, surprise and wariness warring in her chest. Brittany, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I know this is strange, and I know you have every reason to hate me, and honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you hung up right now. Brittany's voice was different than it had been in the courtroom, quieter, stripped of the confidence that diamond and that laugh had carried. But I've been talking to my own lawyer, and there's something you need to know, something I think you deserve to hear directly from me instead of finding out through court filings. I'm listening, Amelia said carefully. The federal prosecutor's office reached out to my attorney last week, Brittany said, and Amelia could hear her breathing shift the particular unsteadiness of someone working up to a difficult admission. They offered me an immunity deal in exchange for full cooperation and testimony against Ryden. My lawyer says it's a good deal, that without it, I'm looking at potential charges myself, just for having my name on those accounts, even though I swear to you, Mrs. Gallagher, I swear on everything I didn't know where that money actually came from. And you're taking the deal, Amelia said, not quite a question. I'm taking the deal, Brittany confirmed. I wanted you to hear it from me before it becomes public record, because I think I owe you that much at minimum. I know I laughed at you in that courtroom. I know I flaunted that ring like it meant something, like I'd won something. I was so stupid. I didn't know anything about you, not beyond what he told me, which I'm starting to realize was probably a lie too. Amelia felt something complicated move through her chest, not quite forgiveness, not quite sympathy, something more like recognition. She thought about her own 11 years of believing Ryden's carefully constructed version of reality and found it hard to fully condemn a 26-year-old for falling into the same trap in a fraction of the time. What did he tell you about me? Amelia asked, curiosity winning out over caution. Brittany let out a short, humorless laugh. That you were controlling, that you'd basically stopped loving him years ago and just stayed for the money and the lifestyle. That you'd fight him on the divorce out of spite because you couldn't stand the idea of him being happy with someone else. He made you sound... She trailed off, seeming to search for the right word. He made you sound small, bitter. I believed it because I wanted to believe it, because it was easier than wondering why a wealthy, successful man was suddenly available and interested in someone 8 years younger than him, barely 2 years after his marriage started falling apart. None of that was true, Amelia said quietly. I know that now, Brittany said. I've had a lot of time to think sitting in my apartment with my name attached to a federal fraud case, watching my entire nursing career potentially evaporate because I trusted a man who apparently lies as easily as he breathes. I keep thinking about how confident I was in that courtroom. How I actually felt sorry for you. God, that makes me sick now thinking about it. What's your testimony going to establish? Amelia asked, shifting the conversation towards something more useful than shared regret. Everything, Brittany said. Conversations where he explicitly told me the money came from consulting work he knew wasn't true. text messages where he referenced keeping things separate from the divorce mess. The beachfront property, the timeline of the wedding planning, all of it. My lawyer says it's going to be significant, that combined with the forensic evidence and your testimony, the prosecution's case is about as airtight as these things get. Amelia absorbed that for a long moment. Why are you telling me all this directly, Brittany? You could have just let this play out through the lawyers. Because I think I owe you an apology that isn't filtered through legal strategy, Brittany said, voice thick now. I'm sorry. For the laughing, for the ring, for all of it. I was cruel to you in that courtroom, and you'd already survived 11 years of him. I added on to that instead of recognizing what was actually happening. I'm sorry. Amelia sat with the apology for a moment, weighing it, deciding what to do with it. I appreciate you saying that, she said finally. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't still sting watching you flash that ring at me while he sat there claiming he was broke. But I also understand what it's like to be lied to by that man. I hope you land somewhere good after all this, Brittany. I mean that. Thank you, Brittany said, something breaking slightly in her voice. I hope the same for you, more than you probably believe I mean it. The call ended, and Amelia sat at her kitchen table for a long time afterward, processing the strange symmetry of it. Two women who'd once occupied opposite sides of a courtroom, both undone by the same man's lies, finding an unexpected fragile understanding in the wreckage he'd left behind. She called Denise immediately to relay the conversation, and Denise's reaction confirmed what Amelia had already suspected. This is enormous, Denise said. If Brittany's cooperating fully, Kessler's case just got significantly stronger. Insider testimony from someone who was actually inside the deception, corroborating everything the forensic accountants found on paper. Combined with your testimony about the pattern of financial control throughout the marriage and the witness tampering evidence from the harassment campaign, I think we're looking at a case Ryden's attorney is going to have an extremely difficult time defending at trial. Banding. Do you think he'll take a plea? Amelia asked. Chen's smart enough to see the writing on the wall eventually, Denise said. But Ryden's ego has driven every single decision in this entire situation, starting with hiding the money in the first place, instead of just negotiating a fair settlement like a reasonable person. I wouldn't be surprised if he insists on fighting this all the way to trial, purely because some part of him still can't accept that he's lost control of the narrative. Denise's prediction proved accurate within 2 weeks. Chen filed a series of aggressive pretrial motions attempting to suppress evidence, challenge the forensic methodology, and exclude Brittany's testimony as unreliable given her cooperation deal, all of which Kessler's office fought and largely defeated with what Denise described as the kind of thoroughness that makes you feel a little bad for the other side and then remember what the other side actually did. Through it all, Amelia found herself leaning more and more on Nathaniel, not in a way that felt like dependency, but in a way that felt genuinely new after 11 years of marriage that had trained her to expect very little real partnership from a man. He didn't try to manage her emotions or tell her how to feel about the unfolding legal drama. He simply showed up consistently steadily in the small ways that matter to call after a difficult prep session with Kessler, and offered to have his own security team quietly monitor the situation after the harassment campaign dinner on a Thursday evening when Maddie was staying at a friend's house and Eli was with Amelia's sister, a dinner that stretched 3 hours longer than either of them expected, because the conversation simply refused to run dry. Can I ask you something? Amelia said halfway through that dinner, emboldened by the wine and the ease of the evening. That has nothing to do with Ryden or the case. Please. Nathaniel said, something warming in his expression. What do you actually do when you're not tracking down financial fraud and testifying in strangers' divorce hearings? She asked, and he laughed genuinely, a sound she realized she hadn't heard from him before. I read too much for a man who runs a company, he said. I have a ridiculous number of unfinished woodworking projects in a garage I never spend enough time in. I have a niece and nephew I try to see more than my schedule usually allows my sister's kids, actually the same sister I mentioned to you. And I've spent the past several years being far too focused on work to build much of a life outside it, which I'm only now starting to notice. Sitting across from someone who makes me want to actually finish one of those woodworking projects instead of just starting a new one. Amelia felt heat rise in her cheeks, unexpected and unfamiliar, after months of feeling like her capacity for that particular kind of warmth had been permanently dulled by betrayal. That's a very smooth thing to say for a man who claims he's bad at building a life outside work. "I'm serious," Nathaniel said, meeting her eyes directly. No performance in it. Nothing like the calculated warmth she remembered from Ryden's early courtship years ago. "I'm not trying to rush anything, Amelia. I know you're in the middle of something enormous, and I know the timing of all this is complicated given how we met. But I'd like the chance to actually know you once the dust settles, not as the woman from the courtroom, just as you." "I'd like that too," Amelia said quietly, and meant it more than she'd expected to when the evening began. The trial date, when it finally arrived 6 weeks later, brought all of it back into sharp, unavoidable focus. The tenderness of that dinner conversation temporarily set aside for the cold procedural weight of a federal courtroom that made Superior Courtroom 302 feel in retrospect like a modest rehearsal. The federal courthouse was a different animal entirely, all marble and hushed formality, security checkpoints and hallways that echoed. Amelia sat in the gallery on the first day of trial, Nathaniel beside her, Denise a row back, with a small group of Amelia's closest friends who'd insisted on being present and watched as Ryden was led in by his attorney, no ankle monitor visible beneath his suit pants, but a stiffness to his movement that suggested he felt its presence anyway. He looked different than he had 3 months earlier in that county courtroom. Thinner, grayer at the temples in a way that hadn't seemed to be there before, though Amelia suspected it had simply gone uncovered by whatever product he used to be too consumed with other things to maintain the performance anymore. He didn't look at her as he took his seat. He hadn't looked at her once since the day of the airport, as if some part of him understood that meeting her eyes now would cost him something he could no longer afford. The prosecution's opening statement was methodical, devastating in its calm precision. Kessler stood before the jury and walked them through the timeline with the same clarity she'd brought to Amelia's interview months earlier, framing each shell company, each transfer, each lie told to a wife and to a court as a deliberate choice made by a man who had every opportunity to be honest and chose deception instead every single time. "The evidence in this case," Kessler told the jury, "will show a pattern spanning 18 months during which the defendant systematically hid over $26 million while telling his wife, his children, and this court that he faced financial ruin. You will hear from forensic accountants who traced every dollar. You will hear from a business partner turned investor who uncovered the pattern independently. You will hear from the defendant's own fiancé, who will testify to conversations in which he explicitly acknowledged the deception. And you will hear from Amelia Gallagher herself, a woman who spent 11 years believing a lie constructed specifically to keep her small, quiet, and unaware of what was actually hers. Chen's opening, by contrast, felt strained even to Amelia's untrained ear, an attempt to reframe the shell companies as legitimate international business strategy, and Brittany's cooperation as the unreliable testimony of a woman securing her own immunity at any cost. It was the argument of a lawyer working with very little actual material, and Amelia could see it landing that way with several jurors' expressions skeptical rather than convinced. The trial stretched across 9 days, each one bringing its own small avalanche of revelation. Dr. Nandan returned to testify in far greater technical depth than the county hearing had allowed, walking the jury through banking records with a patience that made the fraud almost impossible to misunderstand, no matter how Chen tried to muddy the methodology on cross-examination. Nathaniel testified again too this time, facing a considerably more aggressive cross-examination from Chen, who attempted repeatedly to paint his involvement as motivated by personal interest in Amelia rather than legitimate business discovery. "Isn't it true, Mr. Rothschild," Chen pressed, "that your interest in this case accelerated significantly around the same time you began a personal relationship with the plaintiff in the related civil matter?" "Objection," Kessler said immediately. "Relevance, Your Honor. Mr. Rothschild's personal life has no bearing on the forensic evidence his firm uncovered." "I'll allow the question, but keep it brief, Counselor," the judge said. Nathaniel answered without hesitation, voice level. My firm's forensic team identified the concealment pattern in Price Industries' books during a standard due diligence process on an acquired debt position months before I had any personal relationship with Mrs. Gallagher. The findings were flagged by my analysts, verified by 2 separate forensic accountants, and presented to prosecutors based entirely on the financial evidence, which speaks for itself regardless of my personal life. But you did testify voluntarily in the civil matter, Chen pressed. You didn't have to appear personally. I chose to appear personally, Nathaniel said, because I believed the evidence deserved a direct, credible presentation rather than being buried in paperwork a busy court might not fully review. That decision was about the strength of the evidence, Mr. Chen, not about anything personal. Though I won't pretend I'm not glad it eventually led to knowing Mrs. Gallagher better. That doesn't change a single number in those forensic reports. A few jurors' expressions shifted almost imperceptibly towards something like respect at the directness of the answer, and Chen, apparently recognizing the line of questioning wasn't landing the way he'd hoped, moved on without pressing further. Brittany's testimony on the 6th day proved to be exactly the devastating blow Denise had predicted. She sat in the witness box, composed but visibly nervous, and walked the jury through conversation after conversation, text message after text message, each one chipping away at any remaining doubt about Ryden's knowledge and intent. He told me directly, Brittany said, voice steady despite the tremor Amelia could see in her hands, that the money in those accounts needed to stay separate from the divorce noise, his exact words. When I asked him what that meant, he said, and I'm quoting from a text message, I still have saved. Better you don't know all the details, easier for both of us if this stays clean on paper. And did you understand at the time what he meant by that? Kessler asked. I understood he was hiding something from the divorce proceedings, Brittany said. I told myself it wasn't my business, that it was probably just normal business complexity I didn't understand. I know now that was willful blindness on my part, and I've had to sit with that. But I never understood the actual scale of it, or that my name was going onto account specifically because he needed, in his words, a buffer in case things came apart. Ryden sat through this testimony with his jaw locked tight, staring at the defense table, occasionally scribbling something on a legal pad that Chen barely glanced at, the posture of a man who'd finally run out of angles to work. Amelia's own testimony came on the 8th day, and though she'd rehearsed pieces of it with Kessler multiple times over the preceding weeks, nothing fully prepared her for the specific weight of speaking it aloud in front of a jury, in front of Ryden, in front of a room full of strangers whose judgment would ultimately determine what accountability actually looked like. Mrs. Gallagher, Kessler asked, can you describe a specific instance where your husband represented the company's finances as significantly worse than what we now know to be true? Amelia looked briefly at the jury, then deliberately at Ryden, who finally, for the first time in the entire trial, met her eyes. About 16 months ago, she said. Voice steady. Our daughter needed orthodontic work, braces. The estimate was around $6,000. I asked Ryden if we could set up a payment plan through the company account, since that's how we typically handled larger expenses. He told me the company couldn't absorb any additional costs right now, that things were, in his words, bleeding cash badly. I ended up taking a second job at a dental office, answering phones 3 evenings a week, specifically to cover our daughter's braces myself. And what do we now know about the company's actual financial position during that same period? That same month, Amelia said, records show approximately $2 million was transferred into an entity called Castellan Trust. My daughter waited 4 extra months for braces, while I worked nights to save $6,000 during a month when my husband secretly moved $2 million somewhere I wasn't allowed to know about. The courtroom was silent, except for the soft scratch of a juror taking notes, and Amelia held Ryden's gaze through all of it, refusing to look away first, refusing for the first time in this entire ordeal to let him make her feel small in a room where the truth finally outweighed his ability to control it. Chen's cross-examination attempted to paint her testimony as embittered exaggeration, but it gained no real traction against forensic evidence that corroborated every date she'd cited, and by the time she stepped down from the witness stand, something in the room had settled into a certainty that Amelia could feel even without needing a verdict to confirm it. Closing arguments came on the 9th day. Kessler's summation, methodical and devastating, walking the jury back through every count, every dollar, every lie. framing the case not just as financial crime, but as a portrait of a man who'd spent 18 months constructing an elaborate deception at the direct expense of his own children's needs. 14 counts, Kessler told the jury in her final moments, each one representing a specific choice this defendant made over and over again to lie, rather than tell the truth to hide, rather than disclose to protect $26 million, rather than pay for his daughter's braces. The evidence doesn't leave room for reasonable doubt. It leaves room only for accountability. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning, and Amelia sat in the gallery through every minute of that waiting, Nathaniel's hand steady over hers. Denise on her other side, her closest friends filling the row behind her, a support system she realized watching them all gathered there she'd quietly built without fully noticing during the worst year of her life. When the jury foreperson finally rose to read the verdict, the courtroom went utterly silent. The specific silence of dozens of people holding their breath at once, waiting for a single word that would determine the shape of everything still to come. On count 1 conspiracy to commit wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. The word landed and kept landing count after count, 14 times guilty, repeated with a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial, each pronouncement chipping away another piece of the man Ryden Price had spent 18 months pretending to be. By the 7th guilty, Amelia felt tears finally sliding down her face, not from grief this time, but from something closer to release the specific relief of watching a lie that had shaped 11 years of her life finally completely, irrevocably collapse under the weight of truth. Ryden sat motionless as the verdicts continued, Chen beside him with his head slightly bowed, and when the final guilty was read, count 14 witnessed tampering. Ryden closed his eyes briefly, the last visible trace of the man who'd smirked across a courtroom aisle 4 months earlier, finally extinguishing completely. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks out, remanding Ryden into custody, immediately given the flight risk history, a decision that sent a visible ripple through the gallery. As federal marshals stepped forward to escort him from the courtroom, hands cuffed behind his back for the first time in the entire proceeding. He turned just once as they led him toward the side door and found Amelia's eyes across the courtroom one final time. Whatever he was searching for in that look, whether it was forgiveness or anger or simply acknowledgement that she was truly finally free of him, Amelia didn't know, and found sitting there in that gallery with tears still wet on her face and Nathaniel's steady presence beside her that she didn't particularly need to know either. She simply held his gaze calm and unflinching until the marshals guided him through the door and out of her life in every way that would ever matter again. The marshals' footsteps faded down the corridor beyond the side door, and for a long moment nobody in the gallery moved, as if the room itself needed time to absorb what had just happened. Then slowly sound returned to exhale from someone behind Amelia, the shuffle of Denise gathering her files, the quiet murmur of reporters already composing headlines in their heads before they'd even reached the hallway. Nathaniel's hand tightened gently around hers. "It's over," he said quietly. "The part that mattered most anyway." 14 counts, Amelia said, still staring at the empty defense table, at the chair Ryden had occupied for 9 days, now conspicuously vacant. "I keep waiting to feel like it's real." "It'll feel real in pieces," Denise said, leaning forward from the row behind. "First the verdict, then the sentencing, then probably some quiet Tuesday 6 months from now when you realize you haven't thought about him in 3 days and it doesn't hurt anymore. Give yourself time for each piece." Outside the federal courthouse, the press had multiplied since morning, a cluster of cameras and microphones forming an immediate gauntlet the moment the doors opened. Denise moved ahead, prepared as always, positioning herself as a buffer between Amelia and the shouted questions. "Mrs. Gallagher, how does it feel to see your ex-husband convicted on all 14 counts? Do you have a statement for the victims of white-collar fraud who might be watching this case? Is it true you're now in a relationship with Nathaniel Rothschild?" Denise raised a hand, calm and practiced. "Mrs. Gallagher will not be taking questions today, but I'll offer a brief statement on her behalf." She turned, slightly angling herself toward the cameras, while keeping Amelia shielded at her side. "Today's verdict affirms what my client has known for a long time, that the truth, however long it takes to surface, eventually finds its way into the light. Mrs. Gallagher is grateful to the jury, to the prosecution, and most of all, to her children, who have shown remarkable strength throughout an extraordinarily difficult year. That's all we have for today. They moved through the crowd toward a waiting car, questions still trailing after them unanswered, and for the first time in months, entirely unnecessary to answer. Amelia didn't owe anyone an explanation anymore. She'd spent 11 years explaining herself to a man who never deserved the effort, and she found sliding into the back seat with Nathaniel beside her and the courthouse steps receding through the rear window that she had absolutely nothing left to prove to a parking lot full of strangers with microphones. Her phone had been buzzing steadily throughout the drive, and she finally looked at it once they'd cleared the worst of the traffic, finding a string of messages from her sister, from friends from Maddie, who'd apparently been watching the local news coverage from a friend's house, despite Amelia's request that she wait to hear the verdict directly. Mom is at true guilty on everything, Amelia called her immediately. Hey, sweetheart? Yes, guilty on all 14 counts. There was a pause on the line, a long exhale, and when Maddie spoke again, her voice carried a rawness that made Amelia's chest ache. I know I'm not supposed to feel happy about my own dad going to prison. Everyone keeps saying that's a weird thing to feel happy about. But Mom, I feel like I can breathe for the first time in like 2 years. Is that terrible? It's not terrible, Amelia said, throat tight. It's honest. You've spent 2 years watching your father lie to everyone who trusted him, including you. Feeling relieved that the lying is finally over isn't wrong, baby. It's just true. When can we see you? I'm coming home right now, Amelia said. We'll have dinner together, all 3 of us. And Maddie, I want you to know something. None of what happened to our family this past year was your fault or mine. It was his. Every single choice that led to today was his choice. We just get to decide what we build now that it's over. I love you, Mom. I love you too. I'll be home in 20 minutes. She ended the call and found Nathaniel watching her with an expression she was still learning to read, something warm and careful at once. A man giving her room to feel whatever she needed to feel, without trying to fill the space with his own reactions. You're good with them, he said. You're kids. Even in the middle of all this, you never once let the chaos become theirs to carry. I tried not to, Amelia said. I don't know if I always succeeded. Maddie's carried more than a 16-year-old should have to. Eli's quieter about it, but I see it too, the way he watches the news now, the way he asks questions he never used to ask. She looked out the window at the city sliding past, feeling the exhaustion of 9 trial days finally catching up to her all at once. I keep thinking about what Kessler said in her closing, about the braces, about the $2 million moving the same month. Maddie waited for something that basic. I don't think I'll ever stop being angry about that specific detail out of everything. You're allowed to keep that anger, Nathaniel said. Some things don't need to be resolved into peace just because the legal process is finished. Some things just need to be carried honestly instead of buried. Is that what happened with your sister? Amelia asked. Did she ever fully let go of it? No, Nathaniel admitted. But she stopped letting it define every decision she made. There's a difference between carrying something and being ruled by it. I think you're already further down that road than you probably give yourself credit for. They arrived at Amelia's house to find Maddie waiting on the porch, and the moment the car door opened, she was down the steps and into her mother's arms, taller than Amelia, by a couple inches now, but folding into the embrace like a much younger child, holding on tight. Eli appeared a moment later, more reserved as always, hovering near the doorway until Amelia extended an arm and pulled him into the hug too, all 3 of them standing together on the front walk in the fading evening light. Is it really over? Eli asked, his voice smaller than his 12 years usually allowed. The trial part is over, Amelia said, smoothing his hair back the way she'd done since he was small enough to fit entirely in her lap. There's still a sentencing hearing in a few weeks where the judge decides how long he'll be in prison, but the part where a jury had to decide if he did something wrong, that part is done. They said yes. 14 times they said yes. Good, Eli said with the flatness that surprised Amelia, 12 years old, and already fluent in a kind of quiet fury she hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. He deserves it. She didn't correct him. She wasn't sure in that moment that correcting him would have been honest. Dinner that night was simple pasta and garlic bread thrown together, quickly eaten around the kitchen table with an ease that had been entirely absent from their family meals for over a year. Maddie actually talked about school, about a friend's upcoming birthday party, about ordinary 16-year-old things that had felt impossible to discuss during the months when the entire household orbited around court dates and legal terminology. Eli laughed at something Maddie said, a real laugh unguarded, and Amelia found herself simply watching her children exist in a moment of ordinary happiness, feeling something in her chest unclench that had been tight for so long she'd almost forgotten what its absence felt like. Nathaniel had excused himself before dinner, sensing correctly that this particular evening belonged to the three of them alone, but he texted later that night after the kids had gone to bed, a simple message that Amelia read 3 times before setting her phone down. Proud of you today. Not for the verdict for how you carried yourself through 9 days of hell without ever once letting it turn you into someone smaller than who you actually are. Get some rest. You've earned it. She didn't respond right away, sitting instead in the quiet of her kitchen, replaying the day in pieces, the verdict, the marshals. Ryden's final look before the door closed behind him. Maddie's raw honesty on the porch. Eli's flat, certain he deserves it. She thought about the woman she'd been 14 months earlier, sitting across from Ryden at their kitchen table, apologizing for asking about the company's finances, shrinking herself smaller and smaller to keep the peace in a marriage that had never actually been peaceful. Only quiet in the specific way fear makes things quiet. That woman felt distant, now almost unfamiliar, like a stranger she'd once known well, but had long since grown apart from. The 6 weeks before sentencing passed with a different texture than the frantic months preceding trial. Slower, more deliberate, filled with the ordinary business of rebuilding a life rather than fighting to prove one had been stolen. Amelia went back to work full-time, accepting a promotion her employer had been holding for her once the legal chaos settled. She started sleeping through full nights again, a small mercy she hadn't fully appreciated the absence of until it returned. She and Nathaniel continued seeing each other carefully, without rushing both of them, apparently understanding, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever was building between them deserved space to grow at its own pace, rather than being hurried by the dramatic circumstances that had brought them together. Brittany's sentencing hearing, held separately given her cooperation agreement, resulted in probation rather than prison time, the judge acknowledging her substantial assistance to the prosecution and her apparent lack of knowledge regarding the true scope of the fraud. Amelia read about it online, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and distance, a chapter of the story that had touched her life closing quietly without requiring her presence. Denise called 2 days before Ryden's sentencing hearing with a final update. Kessler's office is recommending the high end of the federal guidelines given the witness tampering counts and the flight risk. We're talking about a recommendation in the range of 8 to 10 years, though the judge has final discretion. 8 to 10 years. Amelia repeated, letting the number settle. Eli would be graduating high school before Ryden walked free again. Maddie would likely be finished with college. An entire chapter of their children's lives lived without their father present, a consequence he'd built for himself, one hidden dollar at a time. "How are you feeling about all this going into sentencing?" Denise asked. Amelia considered this question honestly before answering. "I think I feel steady," she said. "Not vindicated exactly, though there's some of that. Not happy because there's nothing happy about watching my children's father go to prison, even knowing he earned every day of it. Just steady, like the ground finally stopped shifting under my feet sometime in the last few weeks, and I didn't even notice exactly when it happened. That sounds like healing to me," Denise said gently. "Even if it doesn't come with fireworks." "Maybe that's exactly what it looks like," Amelia said. "Quiet instead of dramatic. I think I've had enough drama to last a lifetime." She thought about that conversation often in the days leading up to the sentencing hearing, turning it over while she helped Maddie study for finals, while she watched Eli's soccer game from the sidelines, while she sat across from Nathaniel at a small restaurant on a Friday evening that felt for the first time in longer than she could remember entirely uncomplicated. Just 2 people sharing a meal. No courtroom shadows hanging over the conversation, no legal terminology threading through the small talk. "Can I ask you something?" Nathaniel said midway through dinner, an echo of the question she'd once asked him. "What do you want, Amelia? Not what you're owed, not what the case established. What do you actually want now that all of this is finally settling? She considered the question seriously, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem. I want ordinary, she said finally. I spent 11 years performing a marriage that wasn't real, and then a year fighting to prove it. I think I just want ordinary Tuesdays now. Dinner with my kids, a job I actually enjoy. Maybe eventually something real with someone who doesn't need me smaller to feel bigger himself. She glanced up, meeting his eyes directly. I think I might already be finding pieces of that. Nathaniel reached across the table, covering her hand with his. I'd like to help you build all of it if you'll let me. No rush, no performance, just ordinary built honestly for as long as you want me around to help build it. The sentencing hearing arrived on a gray Thursday morning, and Amelia sat in the gallery one final time, watching Ryden Price stand before the federal judge in a prison-issued jumpsuit that had replaced the tailored suits he'd once worn like armor. He looked smaller than she'd ever seen him, stripped finally of every performance, every carefully constructed lie, left with nothing but the truth of what he'd actually done and the consequences that truth had finally caught up to deliver. The judge's voice when the sentence came was measured and final. 9 years federal custody followed by 3 years of supervised release, along with full restitution of all identified assets to be distributed according to the civil settlement previously established. 9 years. Amelia sat with the number, feeling it land, not as triumph, not quite as relief, but as something closer to closure, the final period at the end of a sentence that had taken 14 months to finish writing. Ryden didn't turn to look at her this time, as the marshals led him away. He simply walked forward, head down, toward whatever came next, and Amelia realized watching him go that she didn't need him to look at her anymore. She didn't need anything from him at all. She had everything she actually needed already sitting quietly outside those courtroom doors, waiting to drive her home to the ordinary, hard-won life she'd spent a year fighting to reclaim. The weeks after sentencing settled into something Amelia hadn't felt in longer than she could remember, quiet, that didn't feel like the eye of a storm, but like an actual permanent kind of calm. She woke without the familiar knot of dread in her stomach. She checked her phone in the mornings and found nothing waiting except ordinary messages. A text from Maddie's teacher about an upcoming project, a reminder about Eli's dentist appointment, a good morning from Nathaniel that asked nothing of her except a smile. But calm, she was learning, didn't mean finished. Denise called on a Monday afternoon with a tone Amelia had come to recognize immediately, the specific, measured caution of a lawyer about to deliver news that wasn't catastrophic, but also wasn't nothing. Chen filed an appeal, Denise said. It was expected honestly. 9 years is a long sentence, and defense attorneys almost always file even when the odds are thin. I want you to hear this from me before you see it reported anywhere. Amelia felt her stomach tighten instinctively, an old reflex she thought she'd shed. What are the grounds? Mostly procedural, Denise said. Challenging the admissibility of some of the forensic evidence, arguing the witness tampering counts were prejudicial when combined with the fraud counts, the usual kitchen sink approach appellate attorneys take when they don't have much to work with. I've reviewed the filing. Amelia, I want to be honest with you because you deserve honesty at every step of this, not reassurance for its own sake. I don't think this appeal succeeds. The trial record is clean. Kessler's team built this case like a fortress, but appeals take time, and I don't want you blindsided if this drags into next year. How much time? Could be 8 months, could be 18. These things move slowly, and there's no way to rush them the way we occasionally manage to rush the trial court proceedings. Denise paused. How are you feeling hearing this? Amelia sat with the question, testing her own reaction, the way she'd learned to do over the past year, checking for the old panic, the old spiral. It wasn't there. What she found instead was something steadier, almost surprising in its solidity. I feel like I already survived the version of this that mattered most, she said. He can appeal for years if he wants to. He's still going to wake up every morning in a federal facility, and I'm still going to wake up every morning in my own house, with my kids building a life he doesn't get a vote in anymore. An appeal doesn't change that. That, Denise said, is exactly the right way to hold this. I'll keep you updated as it moves, but I don't want it consuming your headspace the way the trial did. You've earned the right to let this become background noise instead of the main event. Amelia took that advice seriously, more seriously than she might have a year earlier, when every legal development had felt like a referendum on her entire worth as a person. She let Denise handle the appeal's slow procedural crawl through the courts, checking in periodically, but refusing to let it dictate the shape of her days the way the divorce and the trial once had. Instead, she poured her attention into the ordinary, hard-won texture of rebuilding a texture that included increasingly Nathaniel Rothschild becoming a genuine, steady presence in her life, rather than simply the man who'd walked into a courtroom and changed its trajectory. Their relationship had grown slowly, deliberately, in a way that felt almost radical after the frantic dishonesty of her marriage. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He remembered small details, that Eli hated cilantro, that Maddie was nervous about her driving test, that Amelia took her coffee with too much cream, and always apologized for it, as if it were a character flaw rather than a preference. He never once made her feel like she owed him gratitude, shaped like affection, which more than anything else was what finally let her trust the affection that grew between them anyway. 6 months after sentencing, on a warm Saturday evening, Nathaniel invited Amelia and the kids to a small dinner at his home, low-key. Nothing performative about it, just grilled food in the backyard and easy conversation that stretched into the evening. Eli, who'd been guarded around Nathaniel for months, in the particular way boys are guarded around any man who might matter to their mother, finally cracked open somewhere around the second hour, peppering Nathaniel with questions about his work, about the woodworking garage he'd mentioned to Amelia months earlier, about whether he'd ever consider teaching Eli how to use a table saw. "Absolutely," Nathaniel said, "as long as your mother approves and we start with something considerably less dangerous than a table saw. Sandpaper first. We'll work our way up." Eli laughed, and Amelia, watching from across the yard, felt something in her chest expand that had been carefully guarded for months, maybe years, the specific fear that her children might never trust another man in their life after watching their father's carefully constructed lies collapse around all of them. Maddie found her mother in the kitchen later, helping clear plates, and asked the question with the particular bluntness 16-year-olds specialize in. "Do you love him, Mom?" Amelia considered lying, considered deflecting, and then decided, as she'd decided about almost everything over the past year, that her children deserved honesty more than they deserved protection from complicated truths. "I think I'm getting there," she said. "I'm being careful about it because I want to be sure I'm choosing it clearly, not just reaching for it because it's there. But yes, I think I love him. Is that okay with you?" Maddie was quiet for a moment, drying a plate slowly. "He's nothing like Dad," she said finally. "I mean that as a compliment. Dad made everything feel like a performance, even when I was little, even before I understood why it felt that way. Nathaniel just seems like himself all the time. It's kind of nice, actually. Restful." "Restful," Amelia repeated, turning the word over. "That's a good way to put it." "Yeah," Maddie said. "I think you deserve restful, Mom, after everything." The appeal, when it finally resolved 11 months later, ended exactly as Denise had predicted. Denied the appellate court finding no merit in Chen's procedural arguments, the original sentence standing firm. Amelia received the news through a brief, almost anticlimactic phone call from Denise, and found herself surprised by how little emotional weight the confirmation carried compared to how much dread its uncertainty had once threatened to hold. "That's it then," Amelia said. "Really it this time." "Really it," Denise confirmed. "Barring something extraordinary, which at this point I don't anticipate, this case is finished. 9 years stands. The restitution order stands. You should be receiving the final distribution of recovered assets within the next few weeks once the federal forfeiture process completes." The final distribution, when it arrived, felt strange in its own particular way. Not triumphant exactly, more like the closing of a ledger that had been open far too long. Amelia sat with Denise in her office, reviewing the numbers, the $26 million that had once existed only as an abstraction in courtroom testimony, now translating into concrete figures, concrete accounts, concrete security for a future she'd once feared she'd have to rebuild from absolutely nothing. "What are you going to do with it?" Denise asked. Not the first time she'd asked, but the first time the question carried real weight, the money finally tangible rather than theoretical. Amelia had thought about this question for months, turning it over during quiet evenings, during drives to soccer practice, during conversations with Nathaniel, who'd carefully never once offered an opinion on how she should handle her own settlement, understanding instinctively that this was hers to decide entirely and completely. College funds fully funded for both kids, she said. A trust that Ryden has zero access to, ever regardless of what happens after he's released. I want to buy a house outright, something that's actually mine, not something I have to negotiate for or justify wanting. And I want to set some aside for something I've been thinking about for months now. What's that? A foundation, Amelia said, for women going through exactly what I went through. Financial abuse isn't always physical, and it's not always obvious even to the woman living through it. I spent 11 years believing I was being unreasonable for asking basic questions about money. That was it, turns out, half mine the entire time. I want to fund legal resources, forensic accounting support, the kind of help that made the difference for me, but that most women in my situation can't afford on their own. Denise sat back, something like genuine admiration crossing her face. That's a remarkable thing to build out of everything you went through. I don't want it to just disappear into my life like it never happened, Amelia said. I want it to mean something for someone else, too. The foundation launched 8 months later, modest at first, a small office space, and a handful of staff, Amelia serving as its founding director alongside her ongoing work. Nathaniel quietly providing both financial backing and connections to forensic accounting resources without ever trying to take credit or control of a project that was from its very conception entirely hers. The first client the foundation took on was a woman named Carol, 53 years old, married 31 years to a man who'd hidden retirement accounts and business assets throughout a bitter, drawn-out divorce. A woman who arrived at the foundation's small office looking exactly the way Amelia remembered feeling. Small. Uncertain, apologizing for taking up anyone's time with her problems. I don't even know if this is a real case, Carol said, sitting across from Amelia in the small conference room, hands twisting nervously in her lap. Maybe I'm imagining things. Maybe I'm just bitter like he says. Amelia recognized every syllable of that sentence had spoken nearly identical words herself, once in a different office to a different lawyer a lifetime ago, that somehow also felt like yesterday. You're not imagining things, Amelia said gently. And you're not bitter for asking questions about money that's rightfully yours. I promise you, whatever you're feeling right now, however small this whole situation is, making you feel I understand it more than you know. Let's find out together what's actually true. Carol's case, when the foundation's forensic team dug into it, revealed nearly $2 million in concealed retirement assets. And when the settlement finally came through 8 months later, Carol called Amelia, personally crying, thanking her for believing a story that Carol herself had spent years doubting. You gave me my life back, Carol said. You did that yourself. Amelia told her echoing words Denise had once said to her in a hallway that felt like it belonged to a different lifetime now. I just made sure the truth had somewhere to go. 2 years passed in this rhythm, the foundation growing steadily, taking on case after case. Amelia's own life settling into a shape she'd once feared she'd never get to have steady, honest, built-on foundations that didn't crack the moment someone leaned on them. Maddie graduated high school with honors and left for college, that fall tearful goodbyes in a dorm parking lot that felt, despite the sadness of the separation, like watching something genuinely healthy unfold. A daughter stepping confidently into her own life, rather than carrying the weight of her parents' unfinished business into adulthood with her. Eli grew taller, quieter in the particular way teenage boys often do, but steady grounded spending, increasing weekends in Nathaniel's garage, working through woodworking projects that had, true to Nathaniel's early promise, started with careful sandpaper work and eventually graduated to genuine craftsmanship. A small bookshelf Eli built entirely himself, now sitting proudly in Amelia's living room, a physical testament to patience and care that Amelia sometimes caught herself simply looking at, moved by what it represented. Nathaniel proposed on a quiet Tuesday evening, not with elaborate spectacle, not with cameras or grand gestures, but at his own kitchen table over dinner in the middle of an ordinary conversation about nothing in particular, reaching into his pocket and setting a small box on the table between them, with the same steady calm he brought to everything. I know this isn't the movie version of a proposal, he said. No restaurant, no string quartet, nothing performative. I thought about it, actually thought about doing something bigger. And then I realized that's not what we are, you and I. We're this. Ordinary Tuesdays, real conversations. I don't want to propose to you with a performance, Amelia. I want to propose to you with exactly the kind of moment we'd actually choose to spend together anyway, because that's what I want the rest of our life to be built on. Will you marry me? Amelia looked at the box, then at him, feeling something settle into place that had been slowly, carefully building for over 2 years. No rush, no performance exactly, as he'd promised that very first dinner after everything with Ryden had finally truly ended. Yes, she said, and meant it with a certainty that felt nothing like the uncertain hope she'd carried into her first marriage, and everything like the hard-won clarity of a woman who finally fully understood her own worth. They married the following spring, a small ceremony in Amelia's backyard, Maddie serving as maid of honor, Eli walking his mother down a short garden aisle with a seriousness that made half the small gathering tear up before the ceremony even began. Denise attended seated near the front, and afterward, during the small reception, found a quiet moment to pull Amelia aside. I've represented a lot of clients over the years, Denise said. Watched a lot of difficult cases resolve in a lot of different ways. I don't think I've ever watched anyone rebuild the way you did. Not just survive it, Amelia. Actually, rebuild something better than what was taken. I had help, Amelia said, glancing toward Nathaniel, who was deep in conversation with Eli near the small dessert table, laughing at something the now 14-year-old had said. You, him, Kessler. Even Brittany in her own strange way. I didn't do this alone, even though for a long time I thought I might have to. Nobody does the important things alone, Denise said. Even the people who look like they're doing it alone. You just finally had people worth leaning on. It was nearly 3 years after the original verdict when Amelia received a letter that made her pause before opening it, the return address, stamped with the name of the federal correctional facility where Ryden remained incarcerated. She sat with it unopened for 2 full days, before finally on a quiet Sunday morning with Nathaniel beside her for support breaking the seal. The letter was short, the handwriting unfamiliar in its unsteadiness, so different from the confident, controlled signature she remembered from 11 years of shared documents and holiday cards. Amelia, I don't expect you to write back. I don't even know if I deserve a response, and honestly, I've had 3 years now to sit with exactly how little I deserve. I'm not writing to ask for anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand now in a way I clearly didn't understand then what I actually did. Not just to the money, to you, to Maddie and Eli. I spent years telling myself I was protecting our family by controlling everything, and it took losing everything to understand that control was never protection. It was just fear wearing a nicer suit. I hope the kids are doing well. I know I don't have the right to ask, but I hope it anyway. I hope you're doing well, too. I heard about the foundation actually through one of the other men here whose sister used a similar service in another state. When he described it to me without knowing the connection, I recognized exactly what you'd built and exactly why. I'm not proud of much these days, but somewhere underneath all of it, I think I'm proud of that, even though I have no right to be. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think forgiveness is something I'm owed or even something I fully understand how to ask for honestly. I just wanted you to know that the man writing this letter finally sees clearly what the man in that courtroom refused to see. That has to count for something, even if it doesn't count for much. Ryden. Amelia read it twice, then set it down on the kitchen table, feeling the particular quiet that comes after encountering something you expected to feel much larger than it actually does. How are you feeling? Nathaniel asked gently. She considered the question honestly, the way she'd learned to consider every difficult question over the past 3 years. Strange, she said finally. Not angry exactly, though there's some of that underneath it. Not moved to forgive him either, at least not yet, maybe not ever. Mostly I just feel like I'm reading a letter from someone I used to know a long time ago, someone who doesn't really have anything to do with my life anymore. Are you going to respond? I don't think so, Amelia said, folding the letter carefully and setting it aside. Not because I'm still angry enough to punish him with silence, just because I don't think there's anything left to say that would change anything for either of us. He gets to sit with what he did. I get to keep building what I've built. That feels like the right ending, honestly, not cruel, just complete. She kept the letter tucked away in a small box of documents from that entire period of her life, not as a wound to reopen, but as a kind of marker proof of how far the road had actually traveled from that courtroom in Georgia, where a man once smirked across an aisle, certain he'd already won. The Foundation's third anniversary event fell on a bright autumn afternoon, held in a modest event space downtown, filled with women whose lives had been touched by the work Amelia had built from the wreckage of her own women, like Carol, now remarried, and thriving women whose names Amelia had learned over 3 years of careful patient advocacy. Women who'd walked into her office feeling small and walked out, finally understanding the full weight and worth of what had always been rightfully theirs. Amelia stood before the small gathered crowd, Nathaniel in the front row beside Maddie, home from college for the weekend, and Eli, nearly 16 now, and taller than his mother, both of her children watching with the particular pride that comes from seeing a parent build something meaningful out of genuine hardship rather than simply survive it. 3 years ago, Amelia said, her voice steady, carrying easily through the small room, I sat in a courtroom believing I'd already lost everything that mattered. I'd spent 11 years being told in 1,000 small and quiet ways that I was too much and not enough all at once, too demanding. When I asked questions, not smart enough to understand the answers, too bitter. When I finally stopped believing the lies. I want every woman in this room and every woman this foundation will ever help to understand something I had to learn the hardest possible way. You were never the problem. The lie was always the problem. And the truth, once it's finally allowed to speak, is stronger than any story built to keep you small. She paused, letting the words settle, looking out at faces that understood exactly what she meant, without needing further explanation, women who'd each survived their own version of the same quiet erasure. I used to think strength meant never needing anyone, Amelia continued. I know now that's not true either. Strength is knowing exactly what you're worth and refusing to accept less than that from anyone ever again, while still allowing the right people close enough to help you build something better. I didn't do any of this alone. None of you have to do it alone either. That's what this foundation is for. That's what we're building together. The applause that followed felt different from any recognition she'd received throughout the entire ordeal, different from the courtroom verdicts, different from the settlement numbers, different even from her own wedding day joy. This felt like purpose fully realized the specific satisfaction of watching pain transform into something that could genuinely help someone else stand up straighter. Afterward, as the crowd thinned and the afternoon light slanted gold through the windows, Nathaniel found her near the small refreshment table, wrapping an arm gently around her waist. You did that, he said quietly. All of it. I just want you to hear me say it clearly one more time because I don't think you fully let yourself hear it enough. You built this. Nobody handed it to you. You helped. I wrote some checks and made some introductions, Nathaniel said. You're the one who sits across from women like Carol and convinces them their story matters. That's not something money buys. That's something you carry, Amelia. It always was, even back when you didn't believe it yet. She leaned into him, watching Maddie laughing with Eli near the door, watching the last of the afternoon's guests filing out with the particular lightness of people who'd just witnessed something genuinely hopeful and felt for the first time in longer than she could clearly measure, entirely and completely at peace with the life she'd built from the wreckage of the one that had once tried to convince her she was worth nothing at all. She thought briefly of that morning in Superior Courtroom, 302, 3 years and a lifetime ago, of Ryden's confident smirk, of Brittany's diamond, catching the light of her own carefully composed stillness, masking a fury she hadn't yet learned how to fully feel, let alone use. She thought of Nathaniel walking through those courtroom doors for the first time, calm and unhurried, carrying evidence that would eventually dismantle every lie Ryden had ever told her. She thought of every quiet, humiliating moment across 11 years of marriage that had once made her feel invisible, unworthy, too much and not enough all at once. None of it owned her anymore. It had shaped her certainly the way every hard thing eventually shapes the person who survives it, but it no longer defined the boundaries of what she believed herself capable of building. She was no longer the woman quietly enduring humiliation at a defense table, waiting for someone else to hand her permission to exist fully. She was the woman who'd built a foundation out of her own worst year, who'd raised 2 children who understood the difference between real strength and cruel control, who'd found love that asked nothing of her except honesty and offered everything in return. She was finally and completely exactly who she'd always actually been underneath 11 years of someone else's careful, deliberate lies. Free, whole, and absolutely unshakably seen.